Chapter 780. There had to be a reason for this abnormality. The Calamity Army's offensive seemed extremely violent, wave after wave. On all fronts, zombies, skeletons, and ghouls seemed to be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and it would take a lifetime to wipe them all out. Urgent letters asking for help from all over flew to the major cities like snowflakes and were then gathered to Duque. There was so much news that the mages in charge of magic messaging almost collapsed. Most of them were requests to increase the quota of FFF flamethrowers. After actual combat testing, a new type of portable flamethrower, as long as there was enough fuel, could replace a squadron of militia. Duque did not care about these details and directly let his subordinates make arrangements. As a commander, he had to grasp the overall situation. As long as he grasped the essence through appearances and controlled the direction of the overall situation, everything else was just a side issue that could be left to the generals below. However, as a transmigrator, how could Duque continue to lead the alliance forward when the history he was familiar with began to become a little unreliable? That night, Jaina saw a scene that shocked her to the core. She was even convinced by it. On the flagship of the Kratira's navy on the northern coast, in Duque's main cabin, more than 100 magic eyes floated in the air, constantly sweeping over the reports, and then more than 200 magic hands constantly flipping through the pages of military intelligence reports. This was not a report at the army level, and Jaina even caught a glimpse of several reports from local guerrillas. O god of mages, is he still human? Mages could directly reflect what they observed into their minds through the magic eyes, but it was generally limited to one magic eye. Opening two magic eyes at the same time was like looking at two completely different images with the left and right eyes at the same time. The brain would directly overlap the images, and the eyes would be extremely confused. How could Duque read 100 reports at the same time? Just hearing the noisy flipping of the pages, Jaina felt like she was hearing a tsunami. Could this be the strength of a Breaking Dawn mage? However, when she visited Antonidas before, Jaina clearly remembered that Antonidas did not behave so inhumanly. Jaina took a deep breath to calm her racing heart. All mages were people with an incomparable thirst for knowledge. Those without curiosity and motivation would never reach the Radiant Moon rank. The current situation in front of Jaina was that Duque was like a book that seemed easy to understand but could never be finished. Just when she thought that she had gotten close to Duque, she realized that it was just an illusion. It seemed near but was actually far away. He couldn't catch up no matter how hard he tried. This feeling of anger and envy clung tightly to Jaina. No. Well, if Jaina knew that Duque had completely let the system elf control the hand of magic and the mage's eye to gather intelligence, and that he was really corrupt, would he be beaten to death? At this time, Abendis suddenly came into the front hall, holding a large stack of intelligence newspapers in his hand. Duque, the latest news. The Dark Dean, Gondin, has been resurrected and has led 500,000 undead troops to the west to attack the territory of Gilnis. Then, Antonidas reappeared in front of the South Sea Kingdom's defense line for a while, and then disappeared. Arthas also briefly appeared in the north of Sodder Bridge. Jaina couldn't help but say, now the pressure is all on the south of the Rotterdam Kingdom, and our elite troops are doing nothing in the north. Is this really good? Duque raised a finger. First, saving the refugees is our top priority. The people are the soldiers, and the people are our hope. To some extent, exchanging some of the elite soldiers for the lives of the people is equivalent to exchanging part of the present for the future. Even if you look at it as a commander, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Duque raised a second finger. Second, what you see is not necessarily true. And there is always only one truth. Chapter 781. There can only be one truth. After Duque finished reciting the lines, he was shocked and thought to himself, that was close. I actually recited the lines of the Grim Reaper. He rubbed the back of his head and sighed. Wherever he went, the dead would follow. Ugh, he could be considered half a Grim Reaper now. After complaining to himself, Duque raised his head, his eyes glowing. All right, pass down the highest order of the Alliance. I order, The Dark Portal, 19th of August, year 15. The Alliance seemed to have made a decision that outsiders thought was extremely stupid. The main force of the Scarlet Cross, which had been stationed at the northern coast and looked like they were going to reclaim Lordaeron's capital, actually left by ship after staying for a week. It was said that because the undead army led by Jaden had entered the Silverpine Forest and threatened the evacuation of the refugees at the northern coast, they had no choice but to redeploy their troops south. This kind of deployment was taboo for military strategists. Even their own people were shocked, not to mention outsiders. Both Magni and Turayan, who had just arrived at the eastern Plaguelands, were so shocked that they almost bit their tongues. Was this still the same Duque who used to be a god of war? Dan frowned. Turalian, should we question the commander? Turayan, who was over 30 years old, had long lost his youthful aura. After becoming an uncle, he had become more mature and liked to think deeply. After a while, Turayan shook his head. No need. Look, Duque had just returned, and he had already won a great battle against the Scourge and the Orcs. This amazing control proves that Duque is still the magical Duque. We just have to do our own things. Dan shrugged. Our defensive line is good enough. Look, before you came, I had people repair the northern sentry tower. Turayan stroked his beard. Then go and check on the nobles. Every noble will have to take one of your exorcism. If they are spies from the Church of the Damned, then we'll be in big trouble. Dan whistled. Good idea. In Iron Furnace Castle, Magni looked at the worried Alexandros Mograine and smiled. I know Duque. He also trusted Duque. He won't let us down. We can only trust him. Mograine nodded vigorously. The big shots on the Alliance's side all voted for Duke. The big shots outside the Alliance couldn't sit still anymore. The southern part of the Silverpine Forest was now shrouded in terror. The undead of the Scourge formed a sea of rot that easily drowned the territory of Gilneas outside the Greymane Wall. Not even a blade of grass could grow. In the magic mirror, King Xian saw that the lush Silverpine Forest had turned into a black wasteland where even insects could not survive. He cursed angrily, Duke, you little bastard, can't your main force come faster? Aragorn bowed and reminded King Xian, Your Majesty, we are no longer part of the Alliance. Commander Marcus is under no obligation to rescue Gilneas. Shut up. I know. Xian was not the only one with a bad feeling. When he heard that Duke had led his main force away from the borders of Quell, Thalos, the Sun King Anastrian immediately flew into a rage. With one hand, he melted the goblet in his hand that was made of pure gold and inlaid with many precious gems. This news made Kale, who was trying to persuade his father, speechless. Extremely pure fire elements flowed on the old palm of the Sun King, melting the last trace of gold between his fingers. After a while, the Sun King spoke. My child, didn't you say that I was despicable before? You actually used Sylvanas' love for the motherland to use Duque through personal relations to force Duque, the supreme power of the Alliance, to help us Kuel Salis? That was speechless. Now you see? There is no such thing as a saint in this world. At the end of the day, the so-called hero of the first two battles of the Dark Portal, Duke Marcus, is just a person who prioritizes human interests. He doesn't really want to help us High Elves. When the Sun King said this, Kale, finally could not help but interrupt his father. That's because Kuel Salis is not in the Alliance, and the Alliance has no obligation to help us. Even when Duque returned, you never expressed your willingness to return to the Alliance. Anastrian was enraged as well. He knocked the end of his luxurious king's scepter onto Kale, shoulder armor. Although it did not hurt, the strong impact made Kale, feel humiliated. Only the elders of the High Elves would use this method to discipline their underage children. However, Kale, was over 1,000 years old. This meant that his father did not recognize him as an adult elf at all. The Sun King's roar shook the entire inner palace. My stupid child, listen up. No elf would be willing to join the alliance that wants the noble elves to submit to the humans. Your ancestor, Duresma Sunstrider, did not build a country on this continent to make the High Elves human servants. You want to join the alliance? But it must be Kuel Salis who is the alliance leader. Kale, that was dumbfounded. He could not believe it. Was this the troll hero who personally announced an alliance with the humans 2,800 years ago, enlisted the help of the humans, and finally defeated the trolls to obtain Kuel Salis, the home of the High Elves? The Sun King continued to hit Kale, that's shoulder with his scepter. The heavy impact made Kale, that's kneel involuntarily. Open your eyes, my stupid son. Think about the meaning of the elven throne. Only the inheritance of the High Elves is meaningful. No, under extreme circumstances, only the inheritance of the Sunstrider is the only meaning of our existence in this world. Since it was our Sunstrider kingdom that raised Sylvanas, she also has the obligation to die for the Sunstrider family. Anyway, the Windrunner is a traitor. There is nothing wrong with letting the traitor pay with his life. What? What an extremely selfish statement. Is he really my king father? Kale, that was struck by lightning. At this moment he completely lost the ability to speak. As if realizing that he had hit his son too hard, Anastrian's tone finally softened. He patted his son's shoulder. Of course, as a king, I am generous and benevolent. Since Sylvanas voluntarily returned to Kuel Salis, I will not target her and deliberately send her to her death. I will only arrange for her to go to the front line. If she dies in battle, it only proves that she is incompetent or unlucky. If she makes enough contributions, I do not mind promoting her to the position of Ranger Commander, sitting in her sister's position. Chapter 782. Kale, that didn't know how he walked out of the palace. He felt that some kind of belief was collapsing in his heart. Was this the belief he had believed in for 1,000 years? It wasn't the pursuit of the ultimate in magic, but a simple nostalgia for power and worship of power? So what if Sylvanas reached her sister's position one day? There were only so many high positions in the kingdom, like a transparent pyramid that could be seen from the bottom to the top. However, unless one was an elven mage with a noble bloodline, it was impossible to reach the top. The so-called promotion was just a seemingly beautiful and dirty lie. Looking up at the sky, the other side, he suddenly realized that he was very envious of humans, especially Duque. Because Duque, and only Duque, with the talent of a commoner, relied on his own ability and wisdom to reach the highest position in the alliance step by step. And he, Kale, had the identity of a prince, but could only be controlled by his father like a puppet. Under the constraints of the Silver Moon Council, he could do nothing. The seemingly noble identity was, in fact, worthless. The High Elves were extremely long-lived. Although his father was already at the end of his life, who knew how much longer he could live? As long as his father was still alive, he, the Crown Prince, was just an illusory promise that could not be fulfilled in the field of power. Duque, I really envy you. That's looked up at the sky and sighed again. On the other side, at the southernmost front line of the Long Song Forest, Sylvanas was lost. In the eyes of the two ranger generals, Rothamar Theron and Hageron Brightwing, the returned Sylvanas was extremely outstanding. Under her command, the elves worked in full swing to fortify their defenses. It was a method that even the old rangers who had lived for thousands of years had never seen. In the wastelands south of the Long Song Forest, a large area was cleared without grass. It was called the Fire Belt. It was convenient to carry out fire attacks further south. Sylvanas only planted a flag on the hill and decided where to set fire based on the direction of the wind and where the fire would spread. At the source of the river slightly north, a large number of giant ceramic jars were placed, which stored a huge amount of holy water. If the Calamity Army were to cross the river, a few guards would be able to break the jars and give those bones a good laugh. In the forest, Sylvanas began to get someone to make a simple hollow brick. As long as one stayed in the pillbox made of 5 hollow bricks, even the frost arrows of a Morning Star wizard would not be able to penetrate it. If holy water was sprinkled on it, the mages estimated that it could even resist the shadow arrow of a morning warlock. All of Sylvanas' actions were miraculous in the eyes of the elves. She received a lot of praise. Even though she had been away for 10 years and was half a traitor, she was loved by the Rangers almost fanatically, even more than their immediate superiors, Lord Themar and Hadgeron. However, she knew very well that these seemingly simple but extremely effective tricks had nothing to do with her. What she was teaching the Elfins today were all little inventions left behind by Duque back then, little creations. She did not know what Duque's brain was made of. Originally, in the eyes of the world, the only thing that could fight against mystery was mystery. However, Duque had used such a simple and even primitive method to bridge the gap between ordinary people and mysterious beings. What made Servanas even more shocked was that, on the surface, these methods were used to defend against the orcs, but from various clues, it could be inferred that Duque seemed to have predicted the invasion of the Calamity Army when the war with the Horde ended 13 years ago. Looking into the distance in the south, the reports from the Rangers said that the humans there were still actively organizing a resistance. New human reinforcements had already crossed the sea, and they were rapidly building a continuous line of defense. Logically speaking, even if the Calamity Army were to attack Salis, it would not be within the next 1 or 2 months. The High Elves still had plenty of time to prepare for war. However, Servanas's mouth was full of bitterness. "I will not admit defeat. I want to surpass my sister. I want to break away from Duque's protection and make my own career. But, what am I doing now?" After leaving for more than 10 years, although the influence of the Windrunner was still there, after all, becoming a noble and breaking away from the kingdom was almost treason. When she returned to the forest that she was familiar with and crazy about, all she saw was suspicion and distrust in the eyes of the Rangers. However, she could not leave them alone. More than 10 years was almost a generation for the humans. But for the elves who had not changed for thousands of years, it felt like a relatively long nap. Stubborn, self-enclosed. Servanas was shocked to find that most of the Rangers were still prepared to use wooden arrows to deal with the undying of the Calamity Army. What kind of joke was this? Wooden arrows and whatnot, even if they hit the zombie's head, so what? As long as the Lich or Necromancer who controlled the low-level Undying was still there, the zombies would still charge with 100 arrows stuck in their bodies. In order to save her hometown, Servanas had personally sneaked to the front line of the South Sea city-state before coming here. Physical damage was meaningless against the undead. She tried to persuade the Rangers, but to no avail. In desperation, she took out the method that Duque had taught her, using holy light arrows to snipe the enemy leader. Fire and water attacks. Firing towers hanging on the trees and blockhouses on the ground formed a three-dimensional defense line, crossfire. These new terms, these new battle concepts, all came from Duque. Obviously, the defense line of the Long Song Forest was getting stronger day by day, and the chances of defending her hometown were increasing day by day. She should have been ecstatic, but the stronger the defense line was, the more obvious the sense of loss in her heart was, because all these achievements had nothing to do with her. She only stood on the shoulders of the giant Duke Marcus, wantonly plagiarizing and squandering the war wisdom that came from Duque. There would be no harm without comparison. After seeing the prosperity of the Elven Forest and witnessing the rapid economic and technological development in Stormwind, Servanas felt that if the High Elves did not reform, it would not be too long before they were eliminated by the world. But what did she see? A kingdom that would never change. Although she used to be proud of it, when she thought about it carefully, she was shocked to find that the surnames of the higher-ups of the kingdom had not changed since the founding of the kingdom. 13 years ago, she once swore that if she wanted to find a partner, she would find a hero who would not lose to her sister and third sister, a true hero who was far superior to Duque. Unfortunately, looking back at the entire High Elves kingdom, looking at those so-called nobles who were arrogant but did not do anything, Servanas only wanted to vomit. It was still the same sentence. There would be no harm without comparison. Chapter 783. The Dark Portal, 20th of August, year 15. Duke Bolvar Dragon, one of the higher-ups of the Alliance, risked his life to teleport directly to Silver Moon City. He formally stated that the Scourge army was the enemy of the world and hoped that Salis would join the Alliance again. Bolvar did not make any excessive demands. He did not even mention who would be the leader of the alliance. He only hoped that the elves would join as equals. In the end, he was unanimously rejected by the Sun King and the Silver Moon Council. Bolvar left angrily on the same day. Because Bolvar's visit was quite formal, most of the elves received the news. The commoners firmly believed in the kingdom's new magical defensive spell formation, how difficult it was to break, and how it could easily turn millions of undying into ashes. The soldiers at the front line, on the other hand, had an unresolvable worry between their brows. The mysteries of magic were not something that Servanas, Hadgeron, and Lor, Femmer, these ranger generals could understand. But Servanas had been under Duke's tutelage for many years. What left the deepest impression on her was, Duke pointed to his chest and said, "The real indestructible defense is here, not any external object. Be it the fortress or the magical spell formation, they are just toys once you master the knack." The new magic defense array that enveloped the Long Song Forest was, after all, an array made of the seemingly inexhaustible mana of the Well of the Sun. Back then, Dasrima Sunstrider had stolen a small bottle of spring water that Illidan had taken from the Well of Eternity to create the Sunwell as a source of magical energy for the High Elves. In the eyes of others, the Sunwell was already an eternal item. However, even the Well of Eternity was not eternal. Could the Sunwell be invincible? This doubt was buried in Servana's heart. Recently, other than Kale, that's who had managed to sneak out to inspect the front lines, not a single high-ranking mage had appeared in the Long Song Forest. The Silvermoon counselors continued to hold various salons in Silvermoon City every day, forming cliques and attacking their political enemies with trivial matters, fighting for power and profit. Servana's heart was bleeding. She suddenly had an extremely bad feeling. If the Scourge army found a flaw in the magical spell formation, then Kuel Salis would be in trouble. And this time, it was very likely that there would be no savior. August 22nd. This day looked no different from the previous 2 weeks. Despite the constant reports from the south, the Doomsday Troop was still very far away from Kuel Salis. The Holy Light Coalition army formed by Sidon and Turalian managed to keep the Scourge at the Sodaril River between the East and West Plaguelands, while the followers of the Church of the Damned in the East Plaguelands were constantly being wiped out. Servanas began to feel a little foolish. She could clearly sense that the guards sent to guard Long Song Forest were seriously slacking off. If it wasn't for the fact that the Rangers were still actively commanding the arcane puppets to construct fortifications outside the forest, it felt like the construction of the defensive system had already come to a halt. Suddenly, he felt his heart palpitate. By the Sunwell, look to the north. All the Rangers around Servanas subconsciously turned around. Their eyes widened, and every pair of eyes was filled with fear. The most sacred place in Kuel Salis was the Well of the Sun, so the High Elves also worshipped the sun. There were totems of the sun everywhere in the kingdom. However, at this moment, the sky suddenly turned pitch black. The scorching sun had disappeared, and in its place was a black sky covered with ice and snow. A crescent moon emitting a cold and evil aura actually rose near the center of the magic formation. The entire Long Song Forest seemed to resonate with it and trembled slightly. Rustle, the leaves were swaying, and the branches were shaking. Obviously, this was not an illusion. This scene. It was as if some ultimate evil existence was descending. Servanas had never seen a moon like this before, but she vaguely felt that she had seen the same scene before. The cold moon was like a scimitar, mercilessly stabbing from below. Theoretically, it should only be an illusory scene, but when it rose, every high elf heard the sound of something breaking. It was not their hearing deceiving them. There was really something in the sky that they did not understand. At first, the speed at which it broke should have been extremely slow, and even the high elves did not notice it. Soon, in the retinas of the high elves, something like a crisscrossing glass bridge appeared in the sky above the forest. At first, the glass bridge above the crescent moon was pierced, and slowly cracked into a dozen larger pieces. They did not fall to the trees in the forest like real objects, but slowly separated in midair. Then the entire translucent surface appeared densely packed with cracks, and finally burst like a balloon, splitting into countless smaller pieces. They became smaller and smaller, and finally disappeared from the world. At first, Sylvanas and the other High Elf Ranger generals did not know what this meant until Sylvanas shuddered, and suddenly came to a realization. Oh no, the magic defense formation is destroyed. A stone stirred up 1,000 ripples. Once it was spoken, the world was shocked. All the High Elves on the line of defense turned pale at this moment. In the center of the original magic formation, a High Elf in noble clothes with the emblem of the Silver Moon Council on his chest cast a spell. In his hands, hundreds of evil black magic runes seemed to have broken free of the Earth's gravity, flying in all directions, and then firmly sticking to the surrounding void with a diameter of more than 50 meters. At a glance, one could see that these runes formed a huge portal comparable to the size of the Dark Portal. In the first few seconds, this huge portal was like a quiet painting, incomparably quiet. A few seconds later, the portal surged with black magic waves, rolling and churning like boiling water. In the next instant, a few wills emitting evil auras descended. Several demon eyes suddenly opened near the portal, and the disgusting evil eyes spun around quickly, scanning everything in the surroundings. On the other side of the portal, several existences began to pass through the void at high speed, pulling out long, white, cold tails in the illusory sky. The huge portal was like a volcanic eruption, spewing out countless black shadows straight into the sky. It was as if a black rain had fallen from the sky. At first, there were stars, and then the black dots rapidly grew in size in midair. When these dense black dots completely returned to their original form, they had already filled every corner of the forest within a 5-kilometer radius. The Calamity Army! Arthas walked out of the portal with Frostmourne in hand. She tilted her head and revealed an evil smile. Dar, you did well. Chapter 784. The surrounding space gradually darkened, and everything in his field of vision seemed to be covered in a thick layer of black snow. The cold air emitted from Frostmourne dyed half of the Long Song forest a deathly pale white. Darken's dark green eyes reflected the black lines that hung down from the ceiling. It was a characteristic of those who practiced dark magic, but he usually used magic tools to conceal it well. That's right, the strongest fortress was the easiest to break through from the inside. No one would have thought that Darkin Delethil, the guardian of the magic formation and a member of the Silver Moon Council, was actually a degenerate who worshipped dark magic and pursued eternal life. Most importantly, he was not a follower of the Church of the Damned. It was a pleasant surprise that the Lich King, Nizul, had unintentionally discovered when he scanned Kuel Salis with his divine will. Both parties hit it off immediately. As a member of the Silver Moon Council, Darkin's path to promotion had been blocked. He could not advance to Breaking Dawn, nor could he seize the throne of the king. Facing the end of his life step by step, he was unwilling and indignant. That stubbornness and endless thirst for power drove him step by step into depravity. The most prosperous countries were often the easiest to breed the darkest depravity. Darkin was undoubtedly one of the best. This wide-area defensive magic formation that Kuel Salis had spent countless resources, manpower and resources to create could not be completely handed over to Darkin. However, the Sun King and the Silver Moon Council did not expect that the key to the other magic formation was in the hands of the resourceful Ranger General, Theron. Both Theron and Darkin, as well as the elf knight Riadaline who had sought refuge with Duque, were close friends. Darkin easily swindled the magic key to enter the core of the magic formation. The source of mana for the magic formation in the Long Song forest naturally came from the mana vein that extended from the Sunwell. Darkin used the knowledge that the Lich King had taught him to easily reverse everything. Not only did he open the magic array, but he also used the magic power supplied to the magic array to create a portal that was almost as large as the Dark Portal, allowing the million elites of the Scourge army to travel more than 2,000 kilometers and appear in the core area of the Long Song forest. Seeing Arthas walk up to him with his head held high, receiving praise from the leader of the Death Knights, Dalkin trembled in excitement. "Thank you, Your Majesty Lich King, for your appreciation." "Thank you, Lord Arthas, for your praise. You won't be left out. Come, use your hand to hold the edge of Frostmourne. Arthas suddenly thrust the ice demon sword in her hand into the ground. Anyone could easily sense that a wave of extreme coldness was extending endlessly through the ground. The trembling Dalkin hesitated for a moment, but he immediately realized that he had betrayed the High Elves. There was no other way out for him. He clenched his teeth and gripped the edge of the magic sword tightly. Unexpectedly, his finger that touched the edge of the sword was not cut off. Instead, the coldness that gushed out from the magic sword took away his life. Dalkin was dead. However, death was not the end. A lich dressed in blue and white magic robes suddenly appeared behind him. If there were any familiar faces, they would be able to recognize him from his pale face that he was the former Breaking Dawn archwizard Antonidas, who had turned from the most powerful human to the most powerful undying lich. Old Anthony stretched out his bony palm and placed it on the thin layer of ice on Dalkin's back. There was no feeling of touching something hard. Instead, Antonida's palm passed through the layer of ice as if it was soaked in water, pressing against Dalkin's back. Magic circuit? Reconstruct. This is a good material. In a few short breaths, the Breaking Dawn lich retracted his palm, and the ice on Dalkin's body suddenly exploded. Ha! Is this the power of death? Is this the power of immortality? Ha! How sweet! How intoxicated I am! Dalkin came back to life as an undying. The last trace of blood on his body had just faded, and the elements dancing in his palm had all turned into black dark force. How is it? Arthas asked. Willingly transformed into a lich is at least 30% stronger than an ordinary one, Antonidas replied. Very good. The fallen prince laughed. At this moment, Dalkin suddenly discovered that Arthas had yet to draw out Frostmourne. Beneath their feet, the initial undulation had turned into a huge vibration akin to surfing waves. Arthas had arrived. Bottom. Damn. Already. What? Really? This was a demon who had killed his father and master, and sent millions of people from his homeland and the entire continent to hell. The smile on his face turned into a sinister grin. I've always found the High Elves annoying since I was young. Back then, I thought that even though my father said that the Mindful royal family's bloodline was the noblest in the world, how could there be a creature more noble than me? That's why I really wanted to see the expressions on the faces of those arrogant fellows when the turtle shell protecting the elves was smashed. If anyone could see through the thick soil to the ground, they would discover that the magic flowing in the veins of magic that extended from Sun Chaser Island to Silvery Moon City, and then from Silvery Moon City to Longsong Forest, was rapidly changing from a scorching hot flow to a bone-chilling cold. Antonidas used a magic formation to quickly reverse the direction of this incomparably huge flow of magic. Under Arthas's sword, the magic changed and rushed 180 degrees in the direction of Silvery Moon City. Haha. All of you arrogant long-ears can go to hell. Then I want all of you to crawl under my feet. Fire. Two completely different types of magic collided underground. At that moment, the soil of the entire Longsong Forest seemed to glow with a burst of magic. From the center of the Longsong Forest, from south to north, a forest that was 5 kilometers wide, densely packed with magic runes, one yellow and one white, appeared. On the ground of the entire forest, the light that seeped out of the ground flickered continuously. If one looked down from above, they would discover that there was a magic network that looked like tree roots coming out of the ground of the forest. Leave the place where the light is. Sylvanas only had time to shout this. Unfortunately, how many people could escape in such a short time? The south passed through the eastern temple and reached the outside of the forest, while the north passed through all of Silvery Moon City. An incomparably huge light screen that seeped out of the ground and reached the horizon divided the entire Elven kingdom into two. As if there was a delay, an incomparably terrifying explosion occurred. Chapter 785. An earth-shattering shockwave swept through the entire kingdom, all the way to Silver Moon City. In that moment, Every elf in the kingdom felt 1,000,000 times more terrifying than an earthquake. It was a sense of despair, as if the entire world was about to be destroyed in an instant. Starting from the Longsong forest, the 100-meter-tall giant trees along the magical power vein were blown into the sky by the continuous explosions like dominoes. In the forest, Sylvanas tried to use her speed to dodge the shockwave of the terrifying explosion. She wasn't in the direct range of the explosion, but the speed of a hero was useless against the shockwave that surpassed the limits of the human body. With a muffled grunt, she was blasted into a tree by the shockwave. Sylvanas tried to activate a skill in midair to prevent herself from crashing into the tree, but before she could, the tree itself was sent flying. The elves within range of the explosion were turned to ash, and the soldiers outside were also thrown into confusion. The elves' slender bodies were the least resistant to shockwaves, and the shockwave from afar was enough to knock them off their feet. Many were even blown off the ground, crashing into various corners of the forest. The chocobo's feathers danced in the air, and the terrified or dying cries of the chocobos reverberated everywhere. Hadgeron Brightwing was closer to the center of the shockwave, and was blown into the sky by the shockwave. Theron was even more unlucky. She was hit by an exploding magic runestone, and half of her body was paralyzed as she was pinned under an arcane puppet. Lorthmar thought she was dead for sure, but a valiant figure appeared in front of her. A bolt of lightning flashed in her hand, and the arcane puppet that had been destroyed and lost its mobility suddenly bent its arm like a dying man's muscle spasms. In the instant that the puppet bounced up 30 centimeters, Sylvanas had already dug Theron out at a speed that was almost too fast for the naked eye to catch. The next moment, Sylvanas raised her hand, and a gust of wind swept out from her palm, pushing Hadgeron, who was about to fall to his death, away from the tremendous momentum of falling from the sky. He avoided crashing directly into the hard ground, and instead fell into the soft grass in the distance. Hadgeron was in a sorry state. He even had mud in his mouth. However, he knew very well that he was a ranger, not a mage with a slow fall spell. It was all thanks to Sylvanas that he didn't end up as a giant meat pie. However, most of the other rangers were not so lucky to have a heroic ranger general to save the day. Some were pierced by sharp branches, some were thrown dozens of meters away, and then fell heavily into meat paste. Some were affected by the explosion, their bodies were cut off in midair, and they became corpses before falling to the ground. The pitiful state of their subordinates made Hadgeron and Themar even more aware of how dangerous the situation was. Hadgeron spat out the mud in his mouth. "Big sister, I owe you my life." Themar was even more direct. He seemed to have figured out what was going on, and his face turned green and red. "If I don't die today, my life is yours in the future." Sylvanas narrowed his eyes and scanned Themar at high speed. Themar sat up with difficulty. Gritting his teeth, he slapped his dislocated calf back into place. "I only have half of my strength left." Hadgeron quickly checked his equipment and gritted his teeth. "Big sister, you can use my life first when it's critical." Sylvanas pursed his pretty lips and glanced at the rangers who were still able to move. "Sound the horn. Gather all the elves who can still move. We're going back." Hopefully, they could make it in time. The Longsong forest, which had been lush and lush a moment ago, now looked as if it had been plowed by a huge iron plow. The black soil under the forest was scattered in all directions in the huge explosion. In the blink of an eye, a huge, deep scar was formed in the forest. Endless chaotic magic spilled out from the huge black scar. The rangers could not imagine what Silvermoon City was like on the other side of the magical ley line. The whole of Silvermoon City was shrouded in smoke at this moment. The explosion of the magical ley line destroyed more than half of the city. The street from the city gate to the Sunstrider Palace was completely destroyed. Not a single building that was more than 1 floor tall could be seen. Almost every wall turned into powder and fell to the ground. The sound of magic items exploding could be heard continuously. Every street struggled in the flames. The originally flat ground of the entire city was like waves, piling up and squeezing together. Screams came from afar and spread endlessly. Perhaps the more powerful wizards could instantly activate their magic shields to save their lives, but the soldiers and civilians without special abilities were completely at their wits' end. Anastrian, the Sun King, and several members of the Silver Moon Council rushed out. They saw that Silver Moon City, which had been incomparably beautiful just a minute ago, had already been reduced to ruins. There were shocking collapsed ruins everywhere. It was as if a terrible earthquake had happened. By the Well of the Sun, what happened? The Sun King had just finished talking to himself. Screams suddenly came from where the city gate should have been, as well as the vague light of destructive magic. Was that a battle? The screams could be heard clearly even from a few kilometers away because the screams were getting louder and louder. Anastrian was not someone who had never experienced war, but was a fool who had been numbed by peace. He immediately realized that this was definitely a premeditated attack. The increasing dark aura in the direction of the city gate told him the identity of the attacker, the Doomsday Army. They had no intention of saving the victims in the city. The Sun King's expression turned cold. Guards, gather everyone who can fight and set up a defense line in the palace. He ordered his subordinates to set up a defense, but the Sun King didn't enter the palace himself. Instead, he walked out of the palace, surrounded by guards. A Silver Moon Council member asked in shock, "Your Majesty, where are you going?" The Well of the Sun, the hearts of the council members thumped. They realized His Majesty's choice. In the eyes of the king, only the Well of the Sun was the root of the High Elves. He had already abandoned the 100,000 to 80,000 elves who were still alive in Silver Moon City. A council member couldn't help but dissuade the Sun King. "Your Majesty, are you going to abandon your subjects just like that?" Before Anastrian could finish, something even more shocking to him, as well as all the council members and guards, happened. A bridge made of ice suddenly extended from the direction of the city gate to everyone in a few breaths. Before anyone could react, a huge ice disk carrying a few figures that emitted an ominous aura had already arrived. Chapter 786. Huel Salas's self-isolation was for political and military reasons. In fact, the High Elves were everywhere in the Eastern Kingdom in terms of life, economy, and so on. Didn't they see that King Daelin's lover was an elf? Not joining the alliance to fight against the Calamity Army didn't mean that Anastrian didn't know what was going on outside. Even if he knew, his heart still couldn't help but skip a beat when he saw the standard dead face of his old friend Antonidas. There were sounds of moaning and crying, the crackling sounds of fire burning the city, the loud sounds of explosions, and the increasingly loud sounds of killing coming from the original direction of the city gate. The Sun King didn't pay attention to all these sounds. All his attention was on Antonidas, who had become a lich, and the Death Knight beside him who held a skeleton-shaped magic sword. Along with the evil aura that was so thick that it could not be dispersed was the cloudless frost that quickly covered the entire sky above Silver Moon City, blocking out the sun and destroying the summer. 3 seconds later, a voice came from the sky above the Huel Salas Palace. Anastrian, the voice was clear, dignified, and carried an inhuman coldness. It seemed to show its owner's indifference and cruelty towards life. The Sun King squinted his eyes that had crow's feet at the corners. His face scrunched up, and he snorted coldly without showing any weakness. Arthas? Unless the king was as outstanding as Thoradin the Great, humans with short lifespans wouldn't attract the Sun King's attention, no matter if they were high and mighty kings or lowly peasants. But Arthas was different. Apart from his notorious patricide and master-killing, he also represented another meaning, eternity. Even though he was a dead person, his strength made up for his appearance. There was a flash of jealousy in Anastrian's eyes, and Antonidas caught on to his negative emotions. As the most evil magic weapon and a magic sword that could seduce people, Frostmourne wouldn't let go of this point. The whisper from the demon's sword caused Arthas's lips to curl into a strange smile. Sun King stabbed his gorgeous and dazzling golden staff into the stone bricks of the palace and sneered. "You guys are not bad. Darkin, you're not bad either." The Sun King merely glanced at Darkin, the great traitor, before withdrawing his gaze. "If you're here to kill me and snatch the well of the sun," he bellowed in a deep voice. "Bring it on." "Kill you? Snatch the sun well? When have I ever said such a thing?" Arthas chuckled softly. Then, a fanatical look appeared on his face. "No. I'm here on behalf of the Lich King to grant you eternity. As long as you are willing to become a lich, you will be able to exist in this world forever and rule over your subjects forever. Furthermore, you will be even more powerful, strong, big." It was almost as if they were responding to Arthas's declaration. At some point in time, the Death Knights had already passed through the ruins of Silvery Moon and arrived in front of the palace. They dismounted from their skeletal warhorses and knelt on one knee, placing their left hands on their chests to show their utmost respect to the owner of the declaration. The great Lich Antonidas took a step forward and smiled as well. "Old friend, look at how weak you are. Just like how I was a few months ago. Time destroyed our bodies, causing our magic to deteriorate day by day. But now, I'm different." "Different?" After sensing the Sun Well magical power veins that were still flowing under the palace, the Sun King raised his head in disdain and declared confidently, "This is Silver Moon City, my home ground. No existence can defeat me here. Antonidas, you tied with me before purely because we were in a neutral area." "Home ground?" Antonidas smiled mysteriously. "This is not just your home ground." The next moment, Anastrian understood what his old opponent meant. Anguish. All the negative effects that living beings could have became the source of the great Lich's magic power. This was the cataclysm. This was evil. Furthermore, as the Calamity Army continued to teleport into the forest, massacring and spreading fear in Silvery Moon, Antonidas's power would only increase. It was obvious that this was enough to make up for the gap between him and the Great Lich. What made the Sun King most uneasy was that the Calamity Army had occupied one of the three magical power of the Well of the Sun as a source of magic to supply the portal. As time passed, the number of undyings that appeared in the land of Kuel Salis would only increase. But Anastrian was not willing to give up. He had been crowned king for more than 3,000 years. How could he be willing to be the servant of a monster of death that came out of nowhere? "No one can defeat me here." The Sun King roared loudly. Then, the staff in his hand released a dazzling divine light that was even brighter than the sun. "We are not humans." Antonidas sneered and raised his staff high. "Teach him a lesson." Arthas was unmoved. She stood quietly with her sword. A second later, the violent magic that surged out of the elemental realm, enough to change the color of the entire world, was shaped into a completely different nature and form. It collided in midair. On the other side, with Servanas as the leader, an elite elven troop was charging forward. The composition of this troop was very complicated. There were rangers, warriors, spellbreakers, paladins, and many arcane puppets that were originally set up at the front line. Because the attack was too fierce, many people only realized that they had been left behind by the troops after they had dealt with the enemies in front of them. The injured were left behind. Those who could not catch up were left behind. Those who were trapped were also left behind. But none of the elves had any complaints, because they were protecting the king. They were risking their lives to rush back to save their capital, their homeland. At this moment, Servanas did not look like a ranger at all. Instead, she looked more like a goddess of war. With a longbow in hand, she was always at the front of the assault troop, showing off her strong and heroic posture to the elves behind her. The sound of the longbow never stopped. When her left hand was tired, she would switch to her right hand. When her right hand was numb, she would switch to her left hand. Every arrow that carried wind and thunder would definitely blow up the head of the most difficult undyings. Perhaps a lich with powerful magic power could ignore the undyings' defense arrows and break the undyings' magic shields, using the power of thunder to destroy the undying souls. Chapter 787. Or perhaps it was the Death Knights who were skilled in martial arts and good at using dark magic to repair their damaged bodies. The arrows that were as swift as meteors could always find the vital points of the Death Knights. Then there were the lesser lords of the cave demons. Those former spider demons, even if they hid underground, would be blasted into pieces by the huge lightning unless they hid very deep. Sylvanas was like a flag that encouraged all the elves. There were many elves who had fallen behind, but similarly, there were also elves who were trapped in various places and could not break out of the encirclement. They followed Sylvanas without hesitation. To the north. To the north. All the way to the north. Destroy those filthy undead and demons. Kill to Silvery Moon City. Kill until they see their loved ones, until they see their king. Silver Moon City's magnificent platinum and gold city gate had disappeared without a trace. There were gravel everywhere. There were bloodstains everywhere. Death was everywhere. However, this was not important. The belief of protecting the country supported them. Sylvanas, the ranger hero who had returned from the distant southern continent, was leading them. As the number of undead increased, the advancement of the army became slower and slower. At the same time, it was an opportunity for the elves behind to catch up. Coupled with the elves who rushed over from the east and west of the city, the army became larger and larger. Quantitative change eventually led to qualitative change. When the number of people in the army exceeded 10,000, the undead army near the city gate finally could not hold on any longer. Charge! For Quell, Dorii. For Quell Salis. With a thunderous sound, Prince Kale, who was patrolling in the eastern part of the kingdom, arrived. He used 18 consecutive flame blasts to blast a path of destruction among the undead in one breath. As the fire elements were drawn away by the prince, the path to the palace was completely opened. However, the next scene made the hearts of the elves in the army palpitate. After breaking through the undead army near the city gate, they did not see any survivors or corpses along the way. This gave all the elves an ominous premonition. No one said anything. Under the leadership of Sylvanas and Kale, everyone used all their strength to rush towards the sun-chasing king's court. Red pillars, golden spires, snow-white ground. The gorgeous and dazzling palace was as clean, solemn, and beautiful as it was yesterday. Compared to the ruins of the collapsed buildings outside, it was like the difference between hell and heaven. That's wanted to heave a sigh of relief, but just as he was about to step onto the stairs of the palace, he was blocked by Sylvanas. Where are the royal guards? Sylvanas's reminder made Kale, shiver. That's right. That's right. In the past, on every step of the stairs outside the palace, there would be 2 spellbreaker guards of the Wang family who held a red shield that was almost oval in shape and a double-edged sword. Now, not a single guard could be seen. Could it be? The uneasiness in the hearts of all the elves quickly spread. Just as Kale, could not hold it in any longer and was about to rush in with his subordinates, the doors of the palace suddenly opened. There was no light in the huge door. Because the sky was covered by the canopy of undead, and the entire city was filled with a faint, icy mist, no matter how good the rangers' eyesight was, they couldn't see what was happening in the palace. They could only see a figure dressed in luxurious clothes walking out of the palace. After spending 1,000 years together, it was impossible for him to mistake that silhouette and that attire. Father! Kale, was overjoyed as he broke free from Sylvanas's obstruction and rushed forward, running up 7 steps in one go. In the next instant, the prince's body suddenly stiffened as if he had been hit by a petrifying spell. The prince was right. The person who appeared at the main entrance of the palace was the king of Quell Salis, the great Anastrian Sunstrider. But this was the Sun King who appeared in front of the army as an undead. Even as a high elf with a lifespan of thousands of years, Anastrian was already very old. There were age spots and a large number of wrinkles on his face that could not be hidden. His arms and fingers were thin, and his body was a little hunched. At this moment, other than his hunched body standing straight again, there was his deathly gray skin color and his green eyes that carried the light of the netherworld. No, impossible. With father's strength, how could it be so easy? Kale, voice trembled, and his outstretched left hand trembled like a sieve. After the living were killed by the Scourge army, they would turn into evil magic and transform into undead. Everyone knew this. However, Kale, did not believe that his father, who had the support of the magical ley line of the Sunwell, would be so easily killed and transformed into a lich. Kale, was not the only one who was horrified. In the square in front of the palace, every elf who witnessed this scene was shocked out of their wits. At this moment, they completely lost the ability to think. Every elf looked at their king, who had stepped into the realm of undead, with blank eyes. 3,000 years. An Astrian had ruled the High Elf Kingdom for a full 3,000 years. For humans in the world of Azeroth, whose average lifespan was only about 30 years, this was already a matter of 100 lifetimes. It had been such a long time that the fact that an Astrian was the king was imprinted in the deepest part of every elf's soul. This seemed to be the most important part of the world. However, their king was not only dead. He was also turned into an undead. This was not only bad news, but also a double collapse of the soul and faith. Prince Kale, mouth squirmed for a long time before he squeezed out this sentence. Father, why? Did you lose? Lost. An Astrian's facial muscles relied purely on dark power to maintain the so-called liveliness. At this moment, he revealed a resentful expression. Lost. I didn't lose to that bastard Antonidas. I lost to myself. I lost to time. He had lost to this old body. If not for my old age, I could have drawn a large amount of power from the Sunwell endlessly and destroyed any invader. How could I be suppressed by a mere Frostmourne? Suppressed. The moment the former Sun King's voice fell, every knowledgeable elf in the square imagined such a scene. The Sun King resisted and struggled. If he was 1,000 years younger and was a Breaking Dawn mage, of course, he could ignore the bottleneck and wantonly draw the magic power from the Sunwell to destroy all invading enemies. It was a pity that he was too old. Whether it was the total amount of magic power or the amount of magic power output per unit of time, both had declined greatly. So he lost. However, this was not the end of everything. Chapter 788. The Sun King's declaration continued. He suddenly raised his arms high, and terrifying dark magic surged out of his body, enough to cover the sky and destroy all living beings in Silvery Moon. Just the dense aura of dark magic that could choke people to death was enough to make all the mages tremble in fear. Anastrian's magic had recovered. Not only had he recovered to his peak state when he was young, he was even stronger than that. That was almost a demigod, the strongest state at the peak of Breaking Dawn. The Sun King's aged and imposing voice echoed in the air above the square. No, not only that, his voice and image were also broadcasted to every place in Quell, the lost that had a magic mirror through amplification magic, projection magic, and Silver Moon City's own magic broadcasting system. I have to admit that His Majesty the Lich King is more powerful. He is more suitable to be the master of this world. For greater power, for immortality, I, the Sun King, an Astrian Sunstrider, swear allegiance to His Majesty the Lich King and become his general, on par with Arthas Menethil. As soon as these words were said, the world was shocked. Surrendered? The arrogant Sun King had actually surrendered. If the Sun King died in battle, no matter how unreliable his reign was in his later years, the elves would still respect and worship him. A king who died to protect his country and his people was definitely worthy of the people's worship. His bravery would even cause the loyalty of the elves to shift to his successor, Kale the Litz. This was the case in the original history. When Kale, left Kuel Salis to find a new path for the remaining elves, Theron, as the regent, did his best to rebuild his homeland. It was only when Kale, completely fell and betrayed the High Elves that Theron had no choice but to set up another faction. Now, there was a serious deviation in history. Antonidas, who had died and could only wander the Dalajan ruins, had become a great lich. Now, even the Sun King Anastrian had become a great lich. Kel, Thuzad, who was about to be resurrected, then Arthas would have 3 powerful great liches under her command. At this moment, no one knew that a third great lich would appear. Just the fact that the Alliance's 2 Breaking Dawn great wizards had fallen into depravity and become great liches was enough to shock every elf to the point of despair. A Breaking Dawn archmage. That was the supreme combat power of the mortal world. How could he fall just like that? No, father, it shouldn't be like this, it shouldn't be like this. On the other side, Kale, that was already sobbing uncontrollably as he knelt on the stairs. He couldn't accept the fact that his father had become like this. The High Elves loved magic and pursued strength in the mysterious field, but they also loved life. This was why Daoist was able to nurture thousands of rangers who loved the forest in the Long Song Forest. His father did not succumb to the torment of his soul after he died in battle. Instead, he voluntarily became a great lich. This fact, Kale, couldn't accept it. The Sun King sighed. My child, you don't understand the beauty of eternal life, and you can't understand the fear of old people like us who wake up every day feeling like our lives are counting down. If it weren't for Antonidas as an example, I wouldn't have made up my mind to take this step. In a sense, this was the chain effect of Antonidas' fall. His old enemy had fallen from grace and become even stronger, suppressing him. This was something that the competitive Anastrian could not accept. Similarly, this was the dark side of every old man who was afraid of death. However, Anastrian didn't know that after Arthas and Frostmourne realized this, Frostmourne had been using soul whispers to tempt him during the battle just now. No matter what, Frostmourne had succeeded. The Sun King continued to persuade him. My child, think about it. Why can the despicable night elves, who exiled us, have eternal life, while we can only suffer from old age and death? Why do we have to accept the weakening of our power and the restriction of using magic? In the past, there was no way, but now, we can have a better future. Following his words, nearly 10 figures in magic robes appeared beside the Sun King. And Hadron covered their mouths in disbelief. They couldn't imagine that more than 80% of the Silvermoon counselors had chosen to fall like the Sun King. They were all very old. Perhaps with the lifespan of the High Elves, they still had 100 years to live. This was a long time for humans, but it was the end for the elves. The temptation of immortality was hard to resist. Come, my child, let's become one of the undead with me. Let us, father and son, rule Daoist forever and become eternal kings. And all of you will become an indestructible part of the undead kingdom. After persuading his son, the Sun King continued to announce the fate of the other soldiers. No, I don't want to die. Sorry, I can't accept it. The army hesitated. Even though this was an order from their king, the elves were still seriously shaken. If it were any other order, even if it required them to sacrifice themselves, they might gladly accept it. But who could accept becoming such an ugly monster after death, especially the elves who loved beauty as much as their lives? The hesitation soon turned into a commotion. The crowd became agitated. The next second, the situation changed again. A wall of death flames that was 50 meters high, emitting a dark aura, soared into the sky and tightly surrounded the entire square in front of the palace, including the tens of thousands of elves. This was the work of the Sun King. A former Silvermoon counselor walked out and sneered. Lowly subjects, this is not a request from your king, but an order from your king. You can choose not to accept it and be killed, but in the end, you will still become immortals. Or you can voluntarily become immortals. If it's the latter, you can obtain more power than you had when you were alive. Hiss! All the elves gasped. At this moment, as if to demonstrate, a row of Silvermoon counselors released their dark magic power. Suddenly, a black aura soared into the sky, suppressing all the voices of dissent. To kill, become weak, or voluntarily die. Become stronger. If it was death anyway, then there should be no need to consider what choice to make, right? The voice of the Sun King sounded again. Is there anyone else who objects? If not, my child, you will be the first to set an example for everyone. Chapter 789. The Sun King's words forced Kale, that's into a dead end. Which elf in their right mind would commit suicide to become a lich? Putting aside the eternal life that the world tree brought to the night elves, just the lifespan of the high elves was extremely long. It was not a problem for them to live for thousands of years. The world of Azeroth was very kind to the elves. They could maintain their youthful appearance for 90% of their lives. From 100 years of age to decades before their death, they would generally maintain the appearance of handsome men and beautiful women. Most elves loved beauty. Other than Darken, who was a fanatic of dark magic, no one was willing to die and become like that. Of course, it was another matter if they were caught by a Breaking Dawn mage and forced to die. Although they did not want to admit it, there seemed to be clear evidence that a dead Breaking Dawn mage would become stronger. Should they be killed first, become weak, and then be enslaved? Or should they throw themselves into the embrace of darkness? If death was the prerequisite, there was almost no need to consider this choice. Unfortunately, no one wanted to die, especially under such circumstances. Unknowingly, Prince Kale, that had become the focus of the tens of thousands of elites present. Kale, that was the focus of countless sword-like gazes. That feeling was worse than being cut by 1,000 knives. He could clearly hear the thoughts of the elves behind him. We don't want to sacrifice our beauty for power. Lead us to rebel against your father. Kale, that's, since your father is dead, regardless of whether he still exists or not, you are already our king. Why should the living listen to the orders of a dead man? Those who were able to risk their lives to fight their way back to protect the emperor under the shroud of evil forces were naturally not weak. It was no exaggeration to say that the people gathered here were the most elite warriors of Kuel Salis. They did not lack courage, strength, or loyalty to the kingdom. What they lacked was a flag to fight against evil. Obviously, they wanted Kale, that's to be this flag. Kale, that was gentle, sincere, powerful, and had a perfect image. He was the role model of the entire Kuel Salis. At this moment he was also the hope of the elves. Even though they knew that they were no match for him, the hearts of the elves were still in their throats, eager to hear the declaration of resistance from the mouth of their beloved prince. Even if it was just a shout filled with resistance, they would not hesitate to fight the Sun King who had fallen into evil. A Nastrian, who attempted to drag the entire race into the abyss of death in order to not die, did not deserve to be their king. But, they were doomed to be disappointed. That's mouth squirmed. From the trembling of his robe, one could imagine how much his body was trembling under the robe. Your Majesty, Theron suddenly shouted. He hoped to wake Kale, that's up. The dead were already dead. Dead men do not deserve royal power. As long as Kale, that's the righteous prince, raised his arm and called himself king, he would definitely gain the recognition of all the soldiers. That's right. At this moment, Kale, that was already a king in the truest sense of the word. He only needed to take a small step forward. No one expected Kale, that's to actually slowly kneel down. It was obedience to his father, obedience to the former king. Whether it was sincere or forced, he knelt down. Almost every living high elf felt a burning shame. It was the most ruthless kind of humiliation, as if they were being mercilessly whipped in the face. The prince that they had high hopes for was actually such a coward. Your Highness, I was wrong about you. Hadgeron Brightwing, who was not far from Kale, that's roared. But a more powerful female voice interrupted him. It was Theron's voice. You still call him Your Highness. He doesn't even have the most basic respect for the living. He is not worthy of being our king. In the next instant, two huge hands of magic power appeared out of thin air and sent the two ranger generals flying. Then they were pressed to the ground by the huge hands of magic power. Under the power of the mysterious magic, they could only let out muffled groans and could not utter a single word. The Sun King's voice sounded again. Come to me, my child. As a ruler, you must have the strength and dignity of a ruler. You don't have to care about their opinions. No one will oppose us, because they will soon crawl in front of us as undead. They will be our subjects for all eternity. The voice itself had a strong magic power that completely surpassed the radiant moon level. It was so huge and terrifying that no one dared to resist. That Sunstrider surrendered. Perhaps some people would wonder why this Kaizi surrendered so easily. In history, after the fall of his country, he first sought refuge with the Alliance, then was put on death row by Vashch. Then he was rescued by Vashch, poached by Illidan, but did not do well. In the end, he sought refuge with the most unreliable boss, Kill, Jaden, and fell. Someone had once discovered that such a large adult elephant was actually chained by a small iron chain tied to a small iron nail. This was because when the elephant was young, no matter how hard it struggled, it could not break free from the small iron chain. After failing day after day, the shadow of failure had been deeply rooted in its mind, forming a habit and becoming a part of its life. I can't resist this iron chain. Think about it from another perspective. In the human world, being a crown prince for 20 years was already extremely difficult. But because of the long lifespan of the High Elves, being a crown prince for 1,000 years was not a problem at all. More than 1,000 years of accumulated power. More than 1,000 years of taming. Even if he had always resisted, he had never been able to surpass his father. Just this alone would plant an indelible seed of failure in Kale, that's heart. Kale, that was bold enough, he would have long ago overturned the Silver Moon Council and revived the royal power. Kale, that was vicious enough, he would have long ago secretly poisoned his father to inherit the throne. There were many possibilities in this world, but there was only one result. Kale, who was raised in this semi-greenhouse environment, seriously lacked courage and decisiveness. That was why there was Kale, who always placed his hopes on the strong. That was why there was this timid prince who would obey even if he was asked to die. Time seemed to stop. The air seemed to freeze. All of the surviving elves had expressions of extreme horror and fury on their faces. They knew that the following death would be terrifying and miserable. But no one dared to stand up and fight against the incomparably terrifying undead king. Were there no more heroes among the High Elves who dared to stand up and fight against such a terrifying tyrant? At this moment, when every elf yearned for a hero and a leader, a female voice sounded. I object. Chapter 790. Servanas stood at the front of the team, her light blonde hair fluttering in the wind. Her long light blonde hair had been her symbol for the past 1,000 years. At this moment, in front of these 10,000 elite elves, her light blonde hair was a symbol that was beginning to be deified. Servanas' eyes were brighter than when she had been a ranger general. They were more confident and determined, like emeralds shining under the sun. Her long eyebrows, which were unique to elves, were full of heroism and stubbornness. There was no longer the confusion, weakness, and hesitation in her eyes when she was forced to become a paycheck thief under the suppression of the Silver Moon Council more than 10 years ago. There was also no longer the deep, helpless fatigue that was left in the memories of the Rangers. She was wearing a Ranger's outfit. But this Ranger's outfit was completely different from the traditional Ranger's outfit. It was full of her personal characteristics. A dark green cloak fluttered in the cold, turbid wind, accompanied by the fluttering golden hair. Her 2 pauldrons were studded with the fangs of trolls hunted in Stranglethorn Vale, giving her a wild demeanor similar to that of a tribe. It was to commemorate the hatred of the High Elves, and also the glory of her continuous hunting of trolls in the past 10 years. It was the symbol of the king of the forest. Other than the bikini breastplate engraved with lightning runes, her exquisite collarbones and sexy waist were the only things on her body. The dark green breeches that were very suitable for concealment were obviously magic items. But if one looked closely, one would find that there was electricity lingering on them. The Ranger General, after Kale, had surrendered and the 2 appointed Ranger Generals, Lor, Themar and Hadgeron, had been suppressed, there was no doubt that Servanas had become the last hope of these 10,000 elves. She stood ramrod straight. It was like a rising flag. Although everyone could see that she was always at the forefront during the charge, when everyone was covered in dust and even covered in wounds, Her sword, longbow, armor, and accessories were all new and clean. Even her long ranger boots were not stained with dust. She was like a proud commander about to attend a military parade, maintaining the perfect appearance that the high elves wanted to see the most. Normally, even walking through a burning street would cause one to be stained by the ashes of the city. Not to mention, he was able to maintain such a heroic posture after killing over 1,000 undead creatures, both strong and weak. This was not only due to the power of wind and lightning surrounding her, but also the pinnacle of her combat skills. Suddenly, the elves couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. After 1,000 years of intermittent battles with the trolls at the edge of the Long Song Forest, and the baptism of the Second Battle of the Dark Portal, which was the largest in the history of the Eastern Kingdom, the once talented but inexperienced female ranger seemed to be following the footsteps of history and rapidly grew on the path of a queen. A ranger hero and a forgotten queen. Two completely different and unrelated figures seemed to cross the boundary of history at this moment, gradually overlapping and merging into one. The Sun King Anastrian and the Ranger General Servanas. One was at the bottom of the stairs in front of the palace, while the other was high up in the middle of the palace. A king who used to be high and mighty, an exile who had been abandoned by the kingdom. However, their gazes crossed the length of the stairs and met each other in midair. Anastrian ignored Kale, who was kneeling on the stairs and trembling slightly. He lowered his head and used his turbid eyes to look at the rebel who messed up his grand plan to force him to surrender. The Sun King sneered, his words filled with thick sarcasm and disdain. "You object? What right do you have to object? It's rare for you to muster up the courage to object to me, but you still can't stop the lives of you and your possible followers from coming to an end. So what's the point of your objection?" Servanas raised her head high, her beautiful, fearless face glowing with the light of life. "I object. It's because I'm a ranger, and I at least know how to be grateful for the beauty of life. Unlike a guy like you whose brain is rotten, who only treats life as a tool to be trampled on and discarded at will." The Sun King sneered. "Grateful for life? What's the point of such a boring feeling? As long as one is a living creature, one must always have the fear of death. Since one can't abandon the fear of death, then one should find a way to overcome death itself. My foolish subjects. Since you believe that death is terrible and miserable, and you don't dare to take this step yourself, then you should abandon your rationality and let me, as your king, decide everything for you." Servanas said sarcastically, "Let you decide? Do you think you, who have become so ugly, still have the right to decide to make us as ugly as you? Enough. Anastrian, you know that your life is gone, but can you please not continue to exist shamelessly? Don't even try to drag more people to die with you, knowing that you and your followers will not have any redemption in the future." The Sun King was clearly angered by Servanas' rebellious declaration. "You," Sylvanas glanced at Kale, who was still trembling but did not dare to look at her. After sighing softly, she slowly raised the longbow in her hand, drew the bow, and nocked an arrow. She pointed the sharp arrowhead at the high and mighty Sun King, pointing at the once incomparably noble head that had now turned gray and ugly. "Anastrian, you have the right to give up your life, but you have no right to trample on the life and soul of every elf who loves life. With this sentence of yours, I, Servanas Windrunner, hereby declare that I don't recognize the Sunstrider as my king. So, my last advice to you is, go to hell. Undying." Every word was sonorous and powerful. Bit by bit, it seeped into the soul. Every elf, at this moment, felt an incomparably burning sense of excitement gushing out from the deepest part of their soul, spreading to every corner of their bloodline, and igniting every cell in their body. The unsuppressible voice finally turned into a heaven-shaking roar. Thousands of elves shouted in unison, "Go to hell! Filthy undying!" The Sun King suddenly sighed softly. "Fools are fools. You can only live more easily by giving up your life." In the next moment, a lightning-filled shadow was already less than an inch away from his eyes. Chapter 791. If Anastrian's eyes could still see, they would be filled with a deathly chill at this moment. No one could survive such an attack that seemed to transcend space. Even a Breaking Dawn mage would not be able to open a shield in time when his mind was distracted. This soundless explosive shot was definitely Servana's pinnacle work. Unfortunately, Anastrian was no longer human. The fallen Sun King was definitely one of the few peerless powerhouses who stood at the peak of the undying realm. Unlike Antonidas, who had lost many of his magic circuits before his death and almost fell to the Radiant Moon rank, Anastrian had become an undying voluntarily. When the dark power guided by Frostmourne filled his body, his greatest weakness, aging. It was no longer his weakness. Without the bottleneck of using magic, Anastrian's current strength could be said to be at the peak of his personal peak. The arrow that contained lightning spun wildly in front of the Sun King's pupil at a speed of more than 100 revolutions per second. Not to mention a rotten eyeball. Even if it was a city wall, Servanas was confident that he could drill a hole through it. Unfortunately, Anastrian, who was at the peak of mysterious power in this world, had a defense that was not limited to city walls. It was a close call, but the tens of thousands of high elves still heard this word, dark flame barrier. It was not a word that came out of the mouth, but more like it was forcefully stuffed into the minds of every elf through the soul. The dark aura instantly gathered on the Sun King's body, turning him into a black sun filled with an evil aura. High temperature, high heat, terrifying majesty and pressure. That was not an existence that mortals could look at directly. Servanas could not believe her eyes. With her extraordinary eyesight, she clearly saw a layer of black film appear on the retina in front of the Sun King's right pupil. It was as thin as a soap bubble. It gave her a feeling that it would burst with a poke. However, it was this seemingly unreliable and miniature black flame barrier that blocked Servanas's arrow that could be said to be the peak of sneak attacks. If Sylvanas had a high-powered microscope, she could have even discovered that the black flames already had a diamond-level molecular arrangement. Tihis. Sylvanas stomped her foot, and her valiant figure suddenly disappeared from where she stood. Almost at the same time, under her feet, a huge pillar of black flames that was as tall as 10 people and needed 3 people to wrap their arms around it suddenly rose up. The elves nearby screamed and retreated. It was obvious that he had missed the target. It was because in the next second, Servana's figure already appeared 10 meters to the left. He drew his bow and knocked an arrow. The Valkyrie's vigorous figure seemed to move in an instant, appearing at every corner of the stairs to the royal court. Every time it appeared, it would disappear in a flash. Following that, numerous sharp arrows pierced through the air toward the Sun King. If it was any other opponent, they would have been hit by Servana's arrows and become a human-shaped hedgehog. But that was a fallen Breaking Dawn archmage. Sylvanas had used no less than 7 types of arrows, but none of them could penetrate his indistinct black flame barrier. Anastrian's fire magic was still unhurriedly chasing after the female ranger's back. Moreover, the speed of the pursuit was getting faster and faster, not giving the female ranger any time to catch her breath. It was like an evil old cat that kept toying with a mouse after catching it, giving the mouse a chance to escape before catching it again, constantly making the mouse hover between hope and despair. In the beginning, the tens of thousands of elves still prayed for Sylvanas to show her might and destroy this king who had fallen into the abyss of evil. Because they couldn't even step over the black wall of flames in front of the stairs. Soon, they became deeply uneasy. The Sun King's mockery came at the right time. I don't want to admit it, but today the entire high elf race and ancient traditions will be destroyed. Because absolute death has arrived here. It's not a mighty power that mortals can resist. Sylvanas' angry curses came from the air. So you even gave up the noble position that has been passed down for 1,000 years, and would rather become a dead dog to kneel and lick Arthas' boots? Anger without strength is just a meaningless struggle, the Sun King said disapprovingly. You can still speak to me so unyieldingly because you haven't experienced the absolute power of the Lich King, as well as the despair of invincibility. Despair? You're not worthy. Sylvanas' disdainful sneer echoed in the air. If there's a name in this world that brings me despair, that name would be Duke Marcus, not you, an Astrian. His plan that transcends time and space isn't something a fool like you can understand. At the mention of Duque's name, not only Kale, who was still crawling on the stairs and didn't dare to move, but even an Astrian trembled violently. Sylvanus seemed to have found the Sunstrider father and son's sore spot, and mercilessly attacked with his poisonous tongue. Ha! You're right. Even your master Arthas' hand was cut off by Duque. And your master's master, Nizul, was also defeated by Duque. Not to mention you, an Astrian. You're clearly an old dog that's afraid of death, so don't use greatness to cover up your fear of death and cowardice. When it came to arguing, the most important thing was the argument. Although Duque, who was at the peak of the Radiant Moon realm, normally couldn't defeat a Breaking Dawn Great Wizard, everyone loved to hear this argument. I can kill your boss, I can kill your boss, I can kill you. Yes, there's nothing wrong with that. At this moment, over 10,000 elves cheered in unison. The Sun King's face darkened. His originally pale face was now like the bottom of a pot because of the power of darkness. Gritting his teeth, the Sun King said coldly, I once gave you enough opportunities to embrace the supreme power of darkness, but you stubbornly refused. Don't blame me then. You, Ranger General Sylvanus Windrunner, will be displayed in front of all elves as a warning to others for resisting stubbornly. As his voice fell, the Sun King's attack method immediately changed. Space was being divided. Of course, it wasn't that the Sun King's power had reached the point where it could cut through space. It was the wall of flames that was difficult for rangers to pass through, rapidly dividing the entire space. From the largest cube, which had a length, width, and height of 500 meters, it rapidly shrunk, rapidly compressing the space that Sylvanus could move in. Chapter 792. Rangers were not mystics, and rangers did not have a strong life force or defense. In this situation, if she was a holy knight, she might be able to use invincibility to charge in and fight. But as a ranger, from the moment she could not shoot the enemy and refused to leave, Sylvanus' fate was decided. Like a poor bird in a cage, no matter how fast she flapped her wings, she could not break free from the shackles of the cage. Her space to move was getting smaller and smaller. Receive my strongest attack, the fallen king who tried to destroy his people and kingdom. Aner, Alabalor, for the eternal sun. This was Sylvanus' most powerful arrow. It might be effective against other existences. The most powerful arrow often meant that she needed to stop moving and accumulate power. For a mage who had rich defense, control, and countermeasure methods, it was like sending herself to death. On the contrary, the sneak attack from before would be more effective. Sylvanus did not want to use this move until the last moment. Lightning gathered on her body, and the raging wind blew away the black flames that swept over. At this moment, Sylvanus had used all the elemental power she could. Seeing this, Anastrian's gray lips twitched. If I have to shoot this arrow to make you despair and serve me forever, then as you wish, my ranger general. Who wants to serve a rotten bone like you? Her light blonde hair danced in the raging wind, and Sylvanus almost pulled the longbow in her hand to a full moon. The atmosphere shook. The sky echoed with a buzzing sound. The power of this arrow was definitely not small. If it was a city gate without magic protection, perhaps it would be instantly shattered by this arrow. Thump! The vibration of the bowstring finally sounded. She released her fingers that were almost twisted by the bowstring, and as if it had turned into a twisting lightning arrow, it finally left the bowstring. After this arrow was shot, the entire arrow turned into a meteor in midair, shooting towards the Sun King with unparalleled power. But such an arrow only passed through the 3 layers of black flames between her and the Sun King, and was annihilated. It disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed in this world. Just kill me, Sylvanus said through gritted teeth. A sneer appeared at the corner of the Sun King's lips. Ha! He didn't even bother to raise his staff. With a point of his skinny finger, an illusory black skeleton rushed towards her with a roar. Sylvanas let out a whimper. She never cried out of fear or regret. This brief, hoarse whimper was born of anger, hatred, and righteous rage, because she could not stop the evil king, who had become the fallen. Even if she sacrificed everything she had, even her life, she still wouldn't be able to stop it. She suddenly remembered the advice of Elugia and the others before she left. Wait for Duque. Duque will definitely have a way. If you don't have the strength to see through the whole situation, then please wait for Duque's instructions. Suddenly he felt sad. Sister Aurelia, Sister Sasha, was I wrong? In pain and despair, she faced the terrifying black skeleton head-on. She hoped that her magic items could slightly resist this dark magic, but they shattered the moment they touched the black skeleton. Low-level mysteries were defenseless in front of high-level mysteries. The black skeleton hit her. Cold. It was absolute cold that penetrated into her heart, like an ice sword cutting into her body. At this moment, Sylvanas saw Kale, that's turned his head, and their eyes met. The blood drained from Sylvanas' face, and her mind began to blur. Was I hallucinating? A hint of regret appeared on Prince Kale, that's handsome face. Sylvanas' Windrunner felt that she was in free fall. This wasn't in a physical sense, but on a mystical level. It was her soul that was falling. Like a ship that had lost its power in a storm, she was lost. How did I get here? I can't remember. Was I killed by Arthas? Or was it the damn Sun King who did it? There was no concept of time here. Her life wasn't a series of events, but just a moment, a flash of thought in the infinite void. There was only darkness in front of her. Then she felt that she was falling. She really felt it for the first time in a long time. She flinched. She was in extreme pain. She came here. She felt that her soul was being torn to pieces. She only felt pain. Did fighting against evil bravely and protecting her home mean endless pain? Cold. Despair. Fear. Strange things appeared in the endless darkness. Countless relatives and friends died, turning into mindless zombies that staggered around her. Seeing this scene, her heart became fragmented. The purplish-black scar of death passed through the city, splitting it in two. The citizens of Silvery Moon dragged their broken heads and innards behind them as they staggered towards the King of Death, Anastrian. In the end, they knelt on the ground and worshipped the despair that was about to rule them for all eternity. She was angry, but she couldn't resist because the horror that definitely didn't exist in the world of the living was suppressing her. Sharp claws of darkness surged out from all directions and tore at her. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. A pair of evil eyes stared at her from behind, but she couldn't turn back. She saw the Sun King's rotten mouth, his face full of mockery for once playing with her in the palm of his hand. Her soul desperately tried to charge at him, but under the pressure of this horror, she somehow lost the courage to resist. She suddenly found that she had once again become that underage blonde child who was trembling in fear in the dark forest, bearing the consequences of making the wrong choice alone. As expected, my elder sister, my younger sister, is your foresight the most correct? As expected, I shouldn't have been so rebellious. I should have listened to Duque earlier. In the outside world, every elf looked at the female ranger's twitching body in horror and listened to her continuous screams. That was Sylvanas' soul being ravaged and tortured. Every elf felt great pity for her, but also fear for the Sun King. Death coil. With such a simple strike, Sylvanas, who they had placed their greatest hopes on, had been defeated. Their courage was waning, their willpower was beginning to wane, their knees were about to give way, and their bodies were about to kneel. At the very end, suddenly, the Sun King was shot by an arrow. He let out the most mournful scream since his appearance. It was an arrow shot by a young girl who had suddenly appeared at the bottom of the stairs. That girl had a face similar to Sylvanas. Enter Lilith's Windrunner. This is impossible, the Sun King screamed. Of course my arrow can't, but what if it's Alexstras's arrow? The youngest of the Windrunner family smiled faintly. Chapter 793. Sun King's ashen face suddenly twisted. That was anger. That was fear. Sun King's murky eyes turned with difficulty. The vision from his soul finally trembled and focused on his shoulder. The youngest daughter of the Windrunner family was right. That ordinary-looking green arrow was indeed attached to a long red hair that was at least half a meter long. As long as one focused their mind on the hair, anyone with the slightest intuition would be able to clearly feel a mighty dragon's roar coming from it. It was indeed the power of a dragon that stood at the top of the food chain in the world. This terrifying power that seemed to be able to incinerate all unclean things in the world was definitely the power of Alexstrasza, the giver of life. The flame of purification that contained the power of life was definitely the greatest nemesis of undead creatures. In the original history, during the battle at the Heaven's Wrath Gate, under the scheming of the Dreadlord Varimaces, the great potioneer of the Undercity's Royal Potioneering Association, Potioneer Putris, rebelled and used the new plague. The army led by Duke Bolvar and young Salyafar was completely wiped out by the plague. Bolvar was dying, and Red Dragon Queen Alexstrasza used the flame of life to burn the entire battlefield in order to prevent the new type of plague from spreading. This clearly explained why the seemingly more powerful lightning arrow was easily dispelled, and why Lilith's seemingly soft shot could easily penetrate Sun King's defense. Anastrian's body was trembling, and his soul was in fear. It wasn't that the seemingly weaker Lilith had the possibility of killing him, but that there was another possibility. Everyone knew that the Windrunner family was with Duque. Similarly, everyone knew that Duque had saved the Red Dragon Queen and had a life-and-death friendship with her. Otherwise, who would dare to pull out the Red Dragon Queen's hair? Would they be tired of living? Lilith's appearance here with the Red Dragon Queen's hair proved one thing. Duque had made a move. Once a smile appeared on Lilith's poker face, it turned out that she could also make a very intimidating expression. The whisper of the wind that floated into Sun King's ears confirmed his greatest fear. Duke Marcus asked me to send his regards to you. Duque made his move. Duque really made a move? The shock that rose from the deepest part of his soul made the Sun King unable to remain calm. The name of a man is like the shadow of a tree. Duque's crafty schemes and Duque's miracles had long been imprinted in the hearts of the older generation experts. Anyone who had experienced the previous battle at the Door of Darkness would never forget how Duque had calmly held the fort and annihilated the million-strong orc army. The High Elves would never forget how Duque retreated when the Long Song Forest was lost and the tribe's soldiers were at the city gates. That was Duque's highlight. It was also a moment of shame for the elves. The ordinary elves might see Duque as their savior, but the Sun King and the Silver Moon Council would never do that. To them, who prided themselves on their nobility, it was already a great sin for Duque to not sacrifice himself to help the elves keep the tribe out of the Long Song Forest with his army. Whether it was intentional or not, Duque deliberately allowed the tribe to burn and loot in the forest and then forced Kuel Salis to join the alliance. This was an unforgivable sin. In the eyes of the Sun King, Duque was a guy who was written as an ally and read as a poisonous snake. Now, Duque had indeed come and once again gave him the most fatal blow at the most critical moment. The Sun King flew into a rage out of humiliation and roared, "Duque? No, this human brat has no right to touch my kingdom. He obstructs my rule over my subjects. Talent. Duque." The elves in the square did not react at first, but they immediately saw Lilith, who had torn off her disguise and was facing them sideways. It was also a standard ranger outfit, but whether it was the shoulder armor or other equipment, it was clearly the Stormwind standard. And the emblem on her chest. That was clearly the emblem of the Marcus family. The elves were worried. The pride of the High Elves, the Windrunner family, had long been under the command of that living, walking hero. Prince Kael, that had surrendered. Lore, that's in Hadgeron had been defeated. The last elven hero, Servanas, had also been defeated. In the end, it was the Alliance who ended things. Even though the Alliance's help made them feel a faint warmth, they also felt a sense of sorrow. So the glory of the High Elves had long been gone? If Duque had come out at the beginning, the proud elves would definitely not have been able to accept this charity in their hearts. However, when the expectations in their hearts turned into disappointment, then into despair, and the bottom line in their hearts fell again and again, Duque's attack became as sweet and pleasant as agar. The Sun King went berserk. No, even if Duque came, he would not be a match for me. The little girl from the Windrunner family, right? I'll turn you into undead first. I want to see what kind of expression Duque will have on his face when he comes. After saying that, he clenched his skinny hand, and Servana's body, which had lost control, suddenly convulsed more sharply. The vision of fear targeted the second sister of the Windrunner family. She was surrounded by terror. They happily tortured and ravaged her consciousness, taking pleasure in her pain. It was a painful and hopeless situation. It seemed that she would stay here forever, the boundless void, the darkness, and the unknown realm full of pain. Just then she suddenly saw light. It was not a holy gold, but a mysterious purple blue. It was the light of arcane magic. She did not know whether it took a moment for the light to break through the darkness, or a lifetime. The light seemed to have opened its arms and came to save her. In the darkness, an imposing male figure embraced Servana's with a halo of light. She found that she had lost all her equipment and was naked. She helplessly curled into a ball. The first sound she made after she regained her voice was a cry. Servana's Windrunner failed. It was a failure as a high elf. However, the light did not seem to think so. You have done a good job. You and Lilith stalled the fallen Sun King and bought time for the elves to be reborn. It was a familiar voice. It was Duque's voice. Warmth enveloped her. It was a strange feeling that she had never known before. Servana suddenly understood that it was Duque's soul that was warming her soul. Suddenly, she felt a wave of shyness, because everything about her had just been revealed to Duque without reservation, her body, her soul. Strangely, she no longer had the rebellious thoughts. She was like a traveler in the desert who was about to die of thirst, trying to stretch her neck and ask for the quiet and warm refuge of Duque. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and saw a scene that made her feel like she was struck by lightning. When she lost consciousness, she seemed to have kissed her brother-in-law and brother-in-law. Chapter 794. When humans were extremely thirsty, they would instinctively seek water. When humans were extremely cold, they would automatically seek warmth. This was a biological instinct that had nothing to do with love or emotions. Servana's was actually in a situation where her life force was forcefully sucked away, her will damaged, and her soul temporarily weakened. Only those who experienced it firsthand would understand how terrifying Death Coil was when a fallen Breaking Dawn mage threw it at them. Against a class that relied on high agility to dodge attacks, a single hit from a Breaking Dawn mage would definitely freeze her blood, stop her heartbeat, and take her life. This was the result of a Nastrian deliberately holding back in order to force Servana's to surrender. The darkness faded from Servana's eyes, the coldness on her body quickly decreasing, but the color did not recover. Even though there was no need for red, blue, or yellow, even in a world completely composed of lines and outlines, she could still recognize the person who saved her life and soul. Duque, for the past 10 years, every time she dreamt about her sisters at night, the hateful man would always accompany her. Even though she did not want to admit it, she had to admit that he was the most heroic man. The man who could not even find a replacement, much less surpass him. Once upon a time, she sincerely wished for her sisters to choose a true hero as her partner. On the other hand, she was indignant and longed to find a partner who surpassed Duque. It was just that she had never thought that she would be like a young girl in love, offering her kiss as if she was asking for a kiss. Moreover, it was the most precious first kiss. She could not describe the complicated and contradictory feelings in her heart. She was grateful to Duque for pulling her out of the shackles of death and despair, but she also blamed Duque for only coming now. She was also a little conflicted about her own failure. Countless thoughts intertwined, and the end result was that her mind was blank. She stuck out her tongue, as if she was thirsting for water. The result was a classic French kiss. Servana's was about to go crazy. She did not know why she would do this. How was she any different from the noble girl who shamelessly fawned on Duque in the Palace of Rotterdam, hoping to become the Grand Duchess? However, Duque's posture of carrying her was very skillful and incomparably smooth. Cervantes knew very well that Duque was used to carrying his eldest sister and third sister. Although their physiques were slightly different, the three sisters' body proportions were extremely similar. It was as if the third, oh no, the fourth had intruded into the love domain of his eldest sister and third sister, and then the bastard Duque had subconsciously treated her as his sister and accepted her. What kind of bad debt was this? Furthermore, this was in front of tens of thousands of elven subordinates who respected and admired her. Even though Cervantes had already discovered the traces of illusion around Duque, and guessed that Duque had used some kind of illusion to cover up this subtle and chaotic situation, but the inexplicable sense of shame made every inch of her exposed skin turn bright red, as if it was burning. Finally, Cervantes, who had recovered her strength, pushed Duque away and cursed fiercely in the language of the wind. Damn it! I was out of my mind just now. I forgot about this. I order you to forget about this immediately. Okay, if I can do it? Duque was a little helpless. He did not know what this was, but it seemed that he had another bad debt. In all honesty, he had never thought of hitting on Queen Sylvanas. Duque shrugged. Should we deal with the Sun King first? Cervantes knew that Duque was forcibly changing the topic, but she had to suppress her anger and nodded. There must be a reason why Duque appeared at this time. And Duque was the only hope to save hundreds of thousands of her people. Duque's illusion could only fool ordinary elves. Sun King and Kai Zi were shocked when they saw their passionate kiss. Who would have thought that Lilith would suddenly jump out, and then Duque? Duque seemed to have an affair with the two daughters of the Windrunner family? No, for an ambitious person, perhaps this was something that could be used. But Anastrian was more concerned about why the extremely noble Duque would appear here alone. After the leader of the alliance, King Turinas, was killed, although the alliance did not exist in name, among the remaining members, there was no longer a situation where one party was the strongest. In this situation, as the supreme commander, Duque became the person with the highest status. It was not an exaggeration to say that if Duque died, the alliance would immediately collapse. Sun King narrowed his eyes, looking enraged. With a wave of his hand, a huge black wave of fire over 30 meters tall pressed towards Duque's head. Duke Marcus, you have no right to appear in my territory. A breaking dawn bullying a radiant moon was a classic example of the strong bullying the weak. Logically speaking, there was no way that Duque would be spared. The elven mages could almost foresee the scene of Duke carrying their great hero, Cervantes, in a sorry state as he retreated. They did not expect this at all. Oh, is that so? Duque smiled lightly and snapped his fingers. A 40-meter-long battleship blade made of pure golden flames appeared out of thin air. It looked like it could even split a battleship in two with one slash. With just one slash, he had broken through Anastrian's waves of fire in the truest sense of the word. This was a double suppression in terms of quality and attributes. The Sun King, who had clearly lost his vision due to the loss of blood and had just become an undying not long ago, widened his eyes in shock and let out a strange, distorted cry. This? It was not just the Sun King. Every elf who witnessed this miraculous scene cried out in surprise. Normally speaking, this was indeed impossible. Low-level mysteries would undoubtedly be crushed by higher-level powers. It was just like how an egg could not beat a stone, and a stone could not beat a diamond. Even elven children could understand such a simple logic. But why was that? The elven king, who was dressed in luxurious robes, poked the ground with his staff in horror. He discovered that from this moment onwards, the magic vein that extended from the sunwell was no longer responding. Alarm bells rang in his mind. If he could still sweat, Anastrian would definitely be drenched in cold sweat. Since he could not defeat the Calamity army, he might as well turn the entirety of Cuel Salis into a nation of the undead for him to maintain his power and rule. Chapter 795. Shock, shock, shock. Everything that had happened in front of the royal court was full of twists and turns. From the fall of the Sun King to the prince's cowardice, to Savannah's resistance and defeat, and finally to Duke's sudden appearance. Contrary to the expectations of the world, he used the power of the radiant moon to defeat the attack of the fallen Sun King. The scene was so shocking that every elf felt dizzy, and they didn't even dare to breathe. Everyone wanted to say, "Impossible." After all, up until this moment, Duque still had the aura of a radiant moon. Perhaps he was truly at the peak of the radiant moon realm. But since ancient times, many amazingly talented powerhouses had fallen in the face of the merciless passage of time. It seemed like they were just a step away from breaking dawn, but it was actually an extremely high and dangerous threshold. Only an Astrian vaguely realized what Duque had done. "You stole the veins of the earth." His voice trembled as he revealed the truth of the matter. What? Duque could actually use the power of the Sunwell? How was that possible? The method of using the Sunwell had always been a secret of the Sunstrider royal family. Even the counselors of the Silver Moon Council only knew a little about it. How could an outsider like Duque, who wasn't even a high elf, use the power of the Sunwell? After all, there was no possibility of the secret being leaked. The Windrunner sisters that Duque had picked up were only rangers, not high-ranked wizards. What Duque had taken back then was merely a manual for learning the magic circuit of Phoenix Flames. No one would have thought that a freak like Duque could actually use the system elf and his understanding of Phoenix Flames to reverse engineer the control code of the Sunwell's veins of the earth. An Astrian was going crazy. Duque puffed out his chest, his expression full of confidence. "Steal? Why do I remember that it was your father, Dasrima, who stole a bottle of eternal water confiscated from Illidan to create the Sunwell? Besides, if your father's soul is still watching Kuel Salis, he'll definitely be shocked by your depravity and your terrifying idea of trying to defile the well of the sun." An Astrian's lungs were about to explode. "The Sunwell belongs to Queldori. I'm just borrowing it to destroy a villain like you who has desecrated the sacred life." Duque's words obviously appeased the high elves who were a little uneasy. This also made the rangers who loved the forest and life to have a good impression of Duque. Sometimes, Duque wished he was a devil, so that everything he did would be simpler and more violent. Unfortunately, the Alliance's general direction of inclusiveness could not be destroyed. Just like before the fall of the Sun King, he had no right to intervene in the Elf Kingdom. The Alliance was just the Alliance, not the Federation. The Federation was a unified country with only one boss. The Alliance was just a large group of equal kingdoms and forces, a union formed to fight against evil and destruction. If Duque ignored the sovereignty of other countries and wantonly killed their kings, forcing a race or country to join the Alliance, it would mean that the Alliance had changed. It would definitely be opposed by the kings of the various countries, and it would be impossible for there to be a strong alliance in the future. Of course, if the king of a country jumped to the opposing side of the alliance, it would be a different story. Duque turned his head and looked at the shocked Sylvanas with an embarrassed expression. "I'm sorry, I have to first obtain control of the Sunwell before I can save you and your people." Then, Duque waved his hand, and the magic hand that had just suppressed Hadgeron and Lor Themar was immediately shattered, dissipating in the wind. The next second, there was a series of continuous cannon roars on the sea west of Silver Moon City. The sound of the cannons was so loud that it seemed to be blowing away all the clouds within thousands of miles, as if it was going to overturn the entire sky. There was only one fleet in this world that could launch such a dense and violent bombardment, the combined fleet of Kurtiras and Stormwind. The Sun King was horrified. "Didn't your army head south?" A smile appeared on Duque's face. "That's just what you think." At this point, Duque's plan was completely revealed. Although this was not a typical case of the third party benefiting from the fight, Duque had clearly made the Scarlet Cross pretend to go south to support the Silver Pine Forest. In reality, they had circled around the sea, and then hid in the sea west of Kuel Salis. Because the focus of the elves' defense was concentrated on the land in the south, No one had actually discovered such a large army gathering on the sea. When the Sun King fell and changed sides, Duque no longer had any scruples. He decisively sent the largest fleet in history, with a total of 4 digits, to attack the Calamity army that had just landed. This move of Duque's could not be said to be not vicious. In this fleet, there was indeed no one who could match Arthas. The problem was that the magic power of Frostmourne was not endless. Now that Duque had partial control of the Sunwell, if Arthas dared to attack the Alliance's fleet with all his strength, Duque was confident that he could seize the opportunity to take full control of the Sunwell and make things difficult for the two fools. At this moment, on the northernmost Isle of Quell, Donna's in the Eastern Kingdom, Arthas' face was dark. The cannonballs rained down on the Calamity army, and there was nothing he could do. As soon as he sent the gargoyles over, they were immediately blocked by the Griffin Knights of Eagle Nest Mountain, and the two sides fought fiercely above the sea. The gargoyles had the advantage in numbers, but the Griffin Knights had the upper hand in terms of quality. No matter how he looked at it, he would not be able to stop this high-speed fleet for a while. Antonidas. The veteran Breaking Dawn wizard was Arthas' last trump card. However, just as the Great Lich flew into the sky on the Bone Griffin, he encountered a difficult opponent, Krasus. This Kirin Tor counselor did not appear in the form of a high elf. He had returned to his original dragon form. In all fairness, a strong red dragon that was less than 10,000 years old was not a match for the Great Lich. However, based on his understanding of magic, and relying on the natural thick skin and amazing magic resistance of the dragons, Krasus was able to fight Antonidas to a draw. Moreover, Krasus remembered Duque's instructions. Don't fight Antonidas head-on, and don't protect a ship. You just need to keep him busy for 10 minutes, 20 minutes at most, and I'll be able to rush over to deal with him. Krasus was like a large annoying red fly, flying around at high speed and high magic resistance. From time to time, he would ruthlessly attack Antonidas. Chapter 796. It wasn't that Antonidas didn't try to bypass Krasus and attack the Alliance's warships directly. Krasus didn't care at all. If you want to fight, just fight. If I find an opening, I'll give you a good beating. Taking advantage of the Great Lich's powerful spell, the red dragon bit down, almost biting off the Great Lich's rotten left thigh. The advantage was obvious, but the Great Lich couldn't advance. This was the dragon at the top of the Azeroth food chain. It was extremely difficult to deal with. This stalemate made Arthas a little crazy, and he had to send a message to the Sun King. Anastrian, what are you doing? Isn't it just a radiant moon Duque? Get rid of him quickly and come over. Get rid of Duque? Hearing the death order from the soul, the Sun King was dumbfounded as he watched Duque's mana surge. He had been humiliated twice in one day. Half a day ago, he had lost to Antonidas because of his old age. He had been guarding an almost inexhaustible mana vein in the Sunwell, but he had been defeated because he couldn't transfer mana efficiently enough. Now, he was at a disadvantage because he had brought it upon himself. After transforming into a Great Lich, the bottleneck in converting mana had disappeared, and his efficiency had increased by many times. Unfortunately, if the power of darkness was negative, then the mana of the Sunwell was a classic example of positive energy. Who would have thought that he, the owner of the Sunwell for thousands of years and the master of the Sunwell, would be unable to control the Sunwell perfectly because of the change in his body's attributes? Duke, the schemer, had stolen the control and turned the tables? If Duque had come earlier, then with the advantage of the Sunwell, Anastrian might have had the confidence to fight Arthas and Antonidas head-on. If Duque had come later, Arthas would have used Frostmourne to successfully corrupt the Sunwell and convert its power into evil mana that Anastrian could use at will. Then he would have beaten Duque to a pulp. However, Duque had attacked at this critical juncture, when he was at his weakest, and there was nothing he could do. What was even worse was that he couldn't resist Arthas' orders at all. That was a punishment from a higher level of the soul, and it wasn't something a servant like him could endure. He almost fell to his knees on the spot. He struggled as if to make his posture less unsightly, But this action increased his agony. Anastrian let out a scream from the depths of his soul, and through his withered vocal cords, he let out a furious roar. The roar did not only emit his agony, but also the stench of dark energy. The black aura was visible to the naked eye, like water ripples, spreading out from his mouth in waves. The Sun King raised his staff with one hand and made a summoning gesture with the other, pulling the entire palace out of the embrace of death and tranquility. A neutral arcane light suddenly burst out of the palace. The few fallen counselors behind him also understood what was going on. They activated Flash and left the palace gate. They were located in the towers at the corners of the palace. Of course, the Sun King's trump card was not just the Sunwell's dermic power earth vein. On the surface, the entire sun-chasing royal court was a palace, but in fact, it was only his mage tower. He couldn't resist Arthes's orders, so he could only take a gamble. He was betting that Duque didn't have complete control over the dermic power vein that extended from the Sunwell. As long as Duque's power was weak or flawed, he was 100% sure that he could blast Duque, the detestable troublemaker, into smithereens. Duque gently waved his hand, and a few ranger generals led by Servanas, including Lilith, had a few more magic shields on them, and they slowly floated backward. This was Duque protecting them. Pursing his lips, Servanas still had some embarrassment on his face, and finally said, "Be careful." Thousands of words were all in the word, careful. Duque turned back and smiled. "I will." It was just the simplest response and a gentle smile, but Servanas felt as if his heart was touched by something. Bastard. That's the Sun King. He'd been the king of the entire continent for thousands of years, and his strength was only second to the World Guardian. Are you that confident? Are you that confident that you can control the violent dermic power vein of the Sunwell? Bastard, aren't you afraid of biting your tongue with such big words? In Servanas' heart, the resentment and anger from a moment ago completely turned into worry at this moment. Even she herself didn't realize that her gaze actually couldn't leave Duke's back anymore. Watching the blue and gold-edged lion head image flutter in the wind behind Duque, Servanas' eyes unknowingly became misty. Duque had no time to care about others. Facing a true Breaking Dawn mage was definitely the greatest challenge Duque had faced since he'd transmigrated. Even though he'd stolen the dermic power vein of the Sunwell, and even though he had the help of the system, he didn't dare to let his guard down. Every veteran powerhouse had countless trump cards, and if they weren't careful, they would all be defeated. Resurrection wasn't omnipotent, especially when Duque was facing a Breaking Dawn powerhouse who'd turned from a mage to an evil warlock. Warlocks at the master level and above were all experts at playing with souls. At the thought of this, Duque couldn't help but feel his scalp go numb. Now, Duque had no choice but to experience how terrifying Pharaoh, who'd mastered both mage and warlock magic, was. Duque stretched out his hands in front of his chest, palms facing downwards. He wasn't just controlling it, he was also using his spirit to feel the pulse of magic coming from the Sunwell. The sun shone on all things, bringing warmth and light to all living beings in the Azeroth lands. The calmness and warmth that the Sunwell had always given outsiders was the effect of being solidified and stabilized by complex and powerful magic arrays. The real Sunwell had never been a docile lord. Rather than a well, it was more like a huge and unstable nuclear reactor. It surged like the sun. Irregular energy shocks were occurring at every moment. Some were like raging waves crashing against the shore, giving people an impact and shock that was still within one's imagination. There were also a few shock waves that were earth-shattering and earth-shattering. Without extraordinary power, just touching this power would cause a backlash, let alone controlling it. Not to mention controlling it, just touching it would cause one to be devoured until not even dregs were left. However, in Duque's hands, the power of the Sunwell was suddenly divided into 12 types according to its attributes. Just as the Sun Chaser Court shone brightly, Duque was slowly lifted into the air by the golden, seemingly substantial magic power. Under Duque's feet, there were 12 gigantic magic stairs that extended to the front of the court like stairs. Duque, who was emitting golden light and looked like a god descending to the world, spoke slowly. "Anastrian, don't say that I didn't give you a chance. Show me what you've got." Chapter 797. Prince Gil, Fitz, who had unknowingly stood up and retreated to the side awkwardly, had shock written all over his face. The Sun King Anastrian's face was pale, and the skin on his face that was constantly stirring dark magic undulated like waves. "Impossible! Impossible! This can't be true!" Anastrian was going crazy. He didn't want to believe that Duque, an outsider and despicable thief, could actually use the power of the Sunwell better than him, the real owner. Even he only dared to use a giant magic array to purify the magic of the Sunwell, and only used the mildest part of it. How could Duque do this? With a thought, the 12 magic towers at the front of the Xianxia dynasty shone with a dazzling arcane light at the same time. The next moment, accompanied by a strange sizzling sound that sounded like an overload of electricity, the 12 magic lights combined into one, crossed the distance of nearly 100 meters, and blasted in front of Duque. Duque exhaled, and 2 words popped out of his good-looking lips. Libra. It was a concept that did not belong to the world of Azeroth. Libra. In Duque's original world, the legendary Greek goddess of war and wisdom, Athena, had set up 12 harems for her 12 gigolos. It should be said that this was purely a trick that Duque, who had been deeply poisoned by a certain anime, had set up according to the legendary zodiac signs. The use of all elemental magic at or below breaking dawn was nothing more than 3 steps. The first was to summon the maximum amount of magic that one could control, the second was to shape and control the magic, and the third was to release the magic in a safe and correct way. Shaping magic did not only have to consider the mage's control, but also the mage's own imagination. Instead of using those magic models that he was not familiar with, but were theoretically the most optimized, it was better to use some more suitable magic forms that Duque was most familiar with. Therefore, what the High Elf saw from afar was a glittering Einherjar with a blurry face, but wearing a strange armor, carrying a huge golden round shield, blocking in front of Duque. Is it a Einherjar? Or was it some kind of intelligent elemental creature? No one could figure it out, but it was obvious that the attack from the Sun King and the entire Royal Court's Mage Tower was easily blocked. The elemental shockwaves scattered in all directions easily crushed the solid white jade stairs into pieces. This kind of expensive and special stone material, which might not even have a crack after being smashed by a big iron hammer dozens of times, was easily crushed into powder under such a violent elemental impact. No. What is this? Summoning? Or is it something else? Anastrian was at a loss for words. No, in fact, he was thinking too much. This was purely a person's way of showing off. Fallen, Duque told the Sun King, true power can never be obtained through twisted sacrifice. And when you do that, you will only go further and further down the path of self-destruction. I don't need you pointing at me. Sun King let out an even louder roar. He put his palms together, and the magnificent staff floating 1 meter above his head began to spin clockwise at a high speed. The mage towers erected throughout the palace also began to surge with intense elemental undulations. Clearly, this was another big move. Duque did not have the luxury to let the opponent use his big move. Although he had mastered the magical ley line that extended from the Well of the Sun, the so-called infinite magical power was just an illusion. After all, he only controlled the branch and not the Sun Well itself. Moreover, Arthas was rushing to the Sun Well in an attempt to use it to revive Kel Thuzad. Alright, if others used the Sun Well, they would at most draw some magical power or something. Arthas was much more disgusting than the famous dog, Arathika. Calling him an ex-stirrer was already a compliment. The Sun Well that had been used by the idiot in history was directly contaminated by strong evil power, causing the entire territory of Kuel Salis to be filled with rot and plague. How was this an ex-stirrer? This was clearly using a bomb to blow up a septic tank. If he did not want to see Aurelia and Sasha's heartbroken expressions when they returned, Duque's only choice was to end the battle quickly. Duque shouted softly, and a huge circle of golden ripples spread out in the air. The 12 golden stairs beneath Duque's feet instantly transformed into 12 illusory golden giants that were 5 people tall. The 12 golden kidney warriors wielded different weapons, each possessing elemental energy of different attributes. They quickly pounced towards the wizard towers in every corner of the palace. The Sun King was shocked. The reason why wizard towers were so difficult to deal with was because each wizard tower usually only had one main attribute. Once there were many wizard towers, they could use magic of different attributes to support each other. No matter who the enemy was, they would always be able to find a way to deal with them. Now that Duque moved his finger, the 12 golden giants that charged over scared the Sun King's radiant moon liches to the point of pissing their pants. How were these illusory golden giants? They were clearly 12 Breaking Dawn wizard towers that could run, fly, and self-destruct. Of course, Duque could not completely control the earth-shattering power of the Sunwell. If Duque could only control a basin of water the size of a basin, then the Sunwell was at least a standard 50 by 25 meter swimming pool. However, even if Duque was holding a basin, as long as it was not a pool of water that was poured onto Duque's head, Duque had the ability to use the basin to guide the astonishing power of the Sunwell. The simplest way was naturally to divert the energy. Suddenly, a wave of golden light shone brightly. The elemental power that had leapt out from the wizard towers was suppressed by the even larger power of the Sunwell. 12 shocking explosions rang out one after another. The golden dome, the jade-white tower, and the mysterious magic power that lingered around them were all destroyed in an instant. The 12 golden kidney warriors that had crashed into them used their even greater destructive power to easily destroy the towers that had stood in Silvery Moon City for more than 5,000 years. Since the wizard towers had been destroyed, the liches inside naturally did not have it easy. Their gloomy souls carried an indescribable fear as they hovered over the rubble. Looking at their shattered corpses that could never be restored, they widened their eyes in disbelief and looked towards Duque. No, the cries from the souls were hollow and eerie. It was almost impossible to tell how noble and elegant the owner of these voices had been when he was alive. Unfortunately, they could only cry out to vent their anger and fear. At this moment, Duque was practically possessed by the sun god. He was not someone weak souls like them could approach. If they came within 100 meters of Duque, they would be burned to ashes by this terrifying heat. Chapter 798. Bastard, Duke Marcus. If you had such power, why didn't you? The Sun King was interrupted by Duque before he could finish roaring. Duque did not hide the disgust on his face. Do you want to ask why I didn't inform you when I discovered the Calamity Army's movements? Or do you want to ask why I didn't come to Kuel Salis like a plaything to help you block the Calamity Army? Wake up, the glorious era of the High Elves is long over. The Sun King was speechless. The so-called politicians, even if their hearts were filled with filth, would always be like a spring breeze on their faces that were full of acting skills. Now that Duke did not care about politics at all, he did not care about the rules in the field of politics. Instead, he felt that he was at a loss for what to do. Most of the High Elves in the distance could not hear their conversation. Of course, this did not include the strongest ranger generals. The clever Lord Themar had obviously thought about why the human allied forces had appeared at such a precise time. However, how could they blame Duque? How could they vent their anger on the alliance? From the secret notification and warning to the official visit of Duke Bolvar, the alliance had not only extended an olive branch, but also sent an olive tree over. But what did the Sun King and the Silver Moon Council do? Other than playing some dirty little schemes to trick Servana's back, it could be said that he had done nothing at all. The High Elves, especially the Rangers, were grieved by the filth and corruption of those in power. This was not just a year or two. It had been like this since the Troll War 2,800 years ago. It was just that the peaceful years had covered up this filth. Now, when the chaotic times came, the seemingly powerful Kuel Salis showed its corruption and weakness time and time again. The blindly superstitious large area defense spell formation was broken without any use. The first time, it was modified by Ghoul Dan into the storm altar and produced twin-headed ogres to fight the high elves. The second time was even worse. Even the magic of the Well of the Sun in the veins had been used, and the violent energy flow had destroyed more than half of Silvermoon City. If it weren't for Duque and the Alliance's fleet, not only would Kuel Salis have been completely destroyed, but even less than 10% of the millions of elves would have survived. Lor, Themar and Hadgeron looked at each other. They saw the same thing in each other's eyes, anger towards the Sunstrider royal family and the Silvermoon Council, as well as an unparalleled desire for reform. It was impossible for Duque to notice their little thoughts, nor did he have the time to care about such a small matter. He focused all his attention on the Sun King because the Great Lich was ready to fight with all his might. The soul punishment from Arthas was getting sharper and sharper. The once mighty Sun King bent his back in pain and let out a heart-wrenching scream. He was painfully and indignantly aware of what it meant to be unable to please either side. Facing Arthas, he had no power to resist. From the moment he volunteered to become a Great Lich, he was destined to be a tool of the fallen prince. Just like those rotten zombies and pale, rotten ghouls, they were just tools. The crown that still rested on his head was only a final fig leaf. Facing Duque, he also felt a sense of helplessness. Being able to control 2 of the 12 different powers of the Well of the Sun at the same time was beyond imagination. Yet, Duque could still maintain his leisurely manner. Perhaps outside, he could casually beat up Duque 10,000 times. But at this moment and place, Duque was almost invincible. Damn it, how can a short-lived human like you understand the benefits of eternity? You won't understand. You short-lived ghost. The Sun King was already a little out of control. Sensitively aware of the flaw that the Sun King had inadvertently revealed, Duque decided to take the opportunity to expand this flaw. With a faint smile on his face, he replied slowly, "Idiot. Even the eternal life blessing that the World Tree brought to the Night Elves was bestowed by the Red Dragon Queen, Alexstrasza. As the great hero who saved Alexstrasza, do you think I don't have eternal life?" Duque spoke in the whisper of wind. Other than the designated target, the 2 windrunners could also hear the whisper of wind. Lilith didn't feel anything. But after Sylvanas heard it, she blushed at the thought of that possibility. Of course, a Nastrian wouldn't notice the reaction of a mere female ranger. He was completely shocked by Duque's reply. It was as if a bolt of lightning had descended from the 9 heavens and suddenly struck his forehead. Sinolii, this was the most vicious elven curse that good children didn't need to understand. It contained the deepest resentment of the Sun King, which was 10 million times deeper than having sex with a dog. Because of the pursuit of eternity, he made a difficult decision to give up life. He gave up the beauty, nobility, and holiness that the High Elves were most proud of, and willingly became a dirty and ugly Great Lich. What was it for? In the end, wasn't it for eternal power and power? Now, he didn't hesitate to fall, and he even tricked his assistant, his own son, and even his own guards and subjects. You, Duque, a mere human, actually came out and said that I don't need to become a lich to be a scourge for 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years. Although Duque wasn't too handsome, it was still infuriating to compare. An eternally youthful young man, who looked like he was 18 years old, was 100 million times better than a lich with a rotten face. What? How could a Nastrian stand it? However, just when a Nastrian was so angry that his soul was about to melt, the shameless Duque naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity. He decisively made his move. Countless golden, basin-sized, mysterious magic runes appeared on the ground in every corner of the palace. These runes seemed to be just printed at first, but in just 3 seconds, they turned into dazzling runes. Not only did these runes have a huge mysterious power that could be sensed without experience, but they were also connected with each other by shining threads of light, forming a huge magic array that ran through the entire sun-chasing royal court. You, The long, dry beard that remained on the Sun King's chin was blown away by the blazing magic wind. Before he could scold, Duque's magic array had already been activated. It was a huge golden pillar of light with a diameter of several kilometers, reaching straight into the sky. The shining pillar that connected this world and released a radiance comparable to the sun could be clearly seen from 100 kilometers away. Duque blew up the palace. Chapter 799. This big move was not the traditional mushroom cloud bomb. The entire palace was like a small model directly burned by a giant welding torch with flames. In an instant, it burned to ashes. Every single elf who witnessed this scene was stunned. In the end, they all understood. Their king had fallen, and the Xianxia king's court, which was both the palace and the king's exclusive mage tower, was a hurdle that they could not avoid in resisting the invasion of evil. They had no reason to blame Duque. It was just that when Duque used the power of the Sunwell to destroy the palace that had stood in the northwest of Silvery Moon City for thousands of years and had a history as long as Silvery Moon City, they still felt a sense of emptiness and loss in their hearts. This was a collapse of faith. This was the severance of a legacy. Duque's attack, whether intentional or unintentional, directly broke their last hope for the Xianxia royal family. Yes, the shameless Duque did it on purpose. He did not know if Kale, that's in this life, would fall as he did in the original history. Since Kai, that's chose to kneel to his father, who had become a skeleton, and not be a good loyal minister of the alliance, he jumped to the side of the rebels and licked the dead Nizul, becoming the subordinate of the Burning Legion's subordinate. Kai, that's had to take full responsibility for his actions. Duque did not care who would be the leader of the High Elves, but it definitely could not be the Xianxia king's family or the Silvery Moon Council. In the face of right and wrong, there was no room for even the slightest bit of sand. Duque's attack was absolutely fierce. He had intended to deal with Anastrian and the entire Xianxia king's court in one go. Unfortunately, a veteran Breaking Dawn powerhouse was not so easy to kill. Antonidas would not have knelt so easily if he had not been attacked by a large number of dreadlords. If Anastrian had enough will to resist, with the defense of the Sunwell and the Xianxia king's court, he could have held on for a long time even if he could not win. Of course, if the Sun King did not join the alliance, Duque would rather let the hundreds of thousands of troops sit in the cabin until their butts were sore than let the army come to the rescue. Under such a devastating attack, the Sun King still had the ability to activate a teleportation formation hidden in the palace. The destructive mana of the Well of the Sun had already seriously disrupted the stability of the surrounding space, and even Duque, who had the system elf, did not have the confidence to escape. However, the Sun King had successfully turned into a stream of light and escaped. Duque squinted his eyes, feeling no pity in his heart. He had always been a person who grasped the big and let go of the small. Once the big strategy was achieved, he would not care about the small details. Moreover, the Doomsday Army was not a charity. Arthes wanted the Sun King to block the way, but Anastrian actually dared to run away by himself? In the situation where Nizul still had absolute control over the Scourge, please allow Duque to mourn for the Sun King for half a second. At this time, Nizul was no different from a young wife who had been brutally abused. Jaden could do whatever he wanted with Nizul. He could flatten it or carve Nizul's skull into a urinal. Nizul could only accept it. Nizul was angry at the top, so he could only vent his anger on his underlings. As the underlings of the Burning Legion, when they could complete the boss's task, they could have as many succubi as they wanted, and they could pose in any position they wanted. Not doing their job well? That would be too much. The Scourge was even worse. They did not even have the benefits of succubi, and they were often punished by the soul. This time, it would be strange if Anastrian's soul was not used as fuel, lit on fire, and roasted for chicken wings. So this time, when Duque saw a certain newly promoted Great Lich running away, he only wanted to give this poor thing 4 words. The monstrous golden light finally dissipated, And what appeared in front of the tens of thousands of elves was a huge circular ruin that was so clean that it could be used as a skating rink. Some elves cried on the spot. But more elves began to gather and approach Duque. They looked at the great trader of the high elves, Kale, that Sunstrider, with eyes that could cut people into 1,000 pieces, while waiting for the final orders of their leaders. Many elves had already secretly tightened their grip on the weapons in their hands. If Servanas, Lor, Themar, and the other leaders gave the order to kill this guy, they would probably pounce on him without hesitation. Thulth's face was ashen, and his handsome face had lost all its vigor. His emerald green eyes were unfocused, and even though he had already stood up, he looked more like a walking corpse than a zombie at this moment. A few of the prince's loyal followers, such as the great astromancer Solarian, pursed their lips and gripped their staffs tightly as they stood in front of Kale, that's blocking the increasingly turbulent elven army. Unfortunately, the obstruction of a mere radiant moon mage was meaningless. Just one spark would ignite the anger in everyone's hearts, and the once noble elven prince would be completely destroyed by his own people. Hadgeron was still a little confused. He instinctively hated Kale, that's who had sold everyone's lives and succumbed to his father's evil might. But he could not personally kill Prince Kale, that's who had not done anything evil. What do we do? Servanas raised his head and looked at Duque. To a certain extent, this was no longer the internal affairs of a mere elven kingdom. Now, everyone knew that without the support of the Alliance, the elves would not be far away from extinction. Duque took a deep breath. Right now, the Alliance's greatest enemy is the Burning Legion and the Scourge Legion, who are trying to destroy the world of Azeroth. The Alliance will definitely strike and absolutely destroy the evildoers and the fallen. When Duque said this, the faces of Kale, that's and his followers, turned pale. Solarian even looked at Duque with a pleading look. Duque understood this look. If he could save Prince Kale, that's life, this great astromancer was willing to pay any price. At this moment, Servanas and Lor, Themar pulled out their arrows at almost the same time. Hadgeron was half a beat slower, and he was also ready to shoot. That's raised his head and revealed a sad smile. In his once clear and charming eyes, there was no resentment or anger, only a calm acceptance of fate. In the face of people and kinship, in the face of powerful evil and weak justice, he selfishly chose the fallen kinship and the powerful evil. Unfortunately, the seemingly powerful evil was directly defeated by a more powerful strategy and strength. He chose this path himself. Now it was time for Kale, that's to pay the price. Even if Duque, who had a good relationship with him, wanted to sentence him to death, he had no regrets. Originally, Kale, that's and his followers were in despair. Who would have thought that the situation would take a turn? The second half of Duque's sentence was, however, Prince Kale, that's actions just now did not directly threaten the Alliance. I don't think Kale, that Sunstrider, is a despicable fallen. So, in the name of the Supreme Commander of the Alliance, I solemnly declare that the relationship between your kingdom and Kale, that Sunstrider, is your kingdom's internal affairs, and the Alliance has no right to interfere. Chapter 800. The three ranger generals looked at each other and quickly walked together to start an emergency discussion. Not only them, but they also quickly summoned the remaining dozen or so ranger captains, mage captains, and garrison captains. After a full 5 minutes of discussion, they reached an agreement. As the temporarily elected leader and representative, Sylvanas stood on a stone platform that only had half of it left. When her voice and image were transmitted by magic to every intact magic mirror in Qul Salis, she spoke loudly. After the discussion of the National Salvation Committee, which was temporarily formed by me, Sylvanas Windrunner, Rothelma Theron, Hadgeron Mingy, and 18 other high-ranking individuals, I, in the name of the president of the Qul Salis Salvation Society, declare that Kale, that Sunstrider, who once joined the Scourge Army, is a traitor. In view of the fact that Kale, that Sunstrider, has not seriously harmed the interests of the High Elves, and based on Kale, that's contribution to the kingdom for more than 1,000 years, we have now decided to strip him of his prince status and sentence him to exile. From now on, Kale, that Sunstrider and his followers must leave the territory of Kuel Salis. At this moment, the camera turned, and Sylvanus asked Kale, "That's, Your Highness Kale, do you have any objections to the people's punishment of you?" Punishment of exile. This was already a great mercy. Since ancient times, no matter which world or which kingdom, treason was a heinous crime that could easily lead to the death of an entire family. As long as they were ruthless, it would not be a big deal to kill Kale, that's directly. Firstly, Kale, that was not sentenced to death, and secondly, he was very popular. The democratic tradition of the High Elves was in effect at this time. In addition, even the biggest master, the Alliance, had let Kale, go. The High Elves who were about to follow the Alliance could not be the clown. In the end, Kale, punishment was more like picking it up high and gently putting it down. Understanding this, even though Kale, was sad, he had no choice but to accept this fact. The former prince had lost the chance to be crowned king forever because of that kneel. The elves quickly took care of their internal affairs. Without needing Duque to urge them, the anxious elves had already spontaneously organized themselves. Sylvanus raised her arms and shouted, "The evil undead are attacking our glory, the sun will. In order to prevent evil from staining our holiness, we must form a stronger assault team to defend the Isle of Quel Danas." Lore, Femar ordered in an orderly manner, divide the army according to the area. Arcane puppets will be at the front, infantry in the middle to protect the division, and rangers on the flanks. Reorganize the army immediately. Captains, report your combat power immediately. Hadgeron, who was in charge of scouting, said, "Bring all the ships that can sail here. I need 5 destroyers to scout the eastern side of the island. Immediately send 2 boats to the Alliance to verify the Alliance's flag. We need to coordinate with the Alliance fleet." On the other side, Duque waited for the elemental tremors to subside before opening the portal. The Alliance's rescue team, led by the Bishop of Holy Light Benedictus, quickly rushed to the ruins of Silvermoon City to help the ordinary High Elves save their compatriots. High-grade Paladin Riadaline led a team of Silver Hand Paladins to Duque's side. She was about to say something when she saw Kale, slowly walking over. Duque stopped Riadaline from trying to block in front of him and slowly walked towards Kale, It was difficult to describe the pain in Kale, heart. For him, today was destined to be a nightmarish day. His hometown had been invaded, and the capital had fallen. His only relative and king, Anastrian, had fallen. For the sake of his family, and to prevent the tens of thousands of elites from being cruelly slaughtered, the prince had chosen to submit. In the end, the situation had reversed. His father, who had given up almost everything for him, had heartlessly abandoned him, leaving him to fend for himself in front of the angry soldiers. It was a miracle that the pain and despair had not driven him crazy on the spot. "I'm sorry, Duque. I seem to have messed up everything. Although I'm sad about this result, as long as the people can live a safe life, I won't have any complaints. Duque, can you promise me? This is a very easy thing for you." Duque nodded slowly. "Tell me, I'll do it." The higher one's status, the harder it was to talk. Many times, the value of a sentence from Duque could not be described as 1,000 words of gold. Now, Duque had agreed without even asking what the content was. Even though Kale, had never thought that he and Duque were best friends, he still felt that it was worth it to make a friend with Duque. A warm feeling arose in his heart. "You really do understand me. But I still hope that you will say it yourself. You will do your best to help take care of the High Elves." Duque smiled gently. "Of course I will take care of the High Elves. Nonsense, if I don't take care of them, won't Aurelia and Sasha skin me alive? Then I have no regrets." Unexpectedly, at this moment, Kale, could show such a sincere smile from the bottom of his heart. Duque was stunned for a moment. Then, Duque remembered the tragic ending of Kale, in the original history. In the original history, the Sun King and all the members of the Silver Moon Council had died in this battle. In the history, Arthas was very principled and did not resurrect the Sun King and the others. The only one who was turned into an undead by Arthas was Servanas, who resisted the most fiercely. He turned Ciri into a banshee of death. When Kale, who was still in the Dalajan, rushed back, he encountered a complete mess. The kingdom had been destroyed, and less than 10% of the people were left. Most of the magic people who relied on the magic of the Sunwell for a long time actually had magic addiction, which was commonly known as magic addiction. In order to take revenge, Kaizi brought the healthiest elves back to the Alliance. Unfortunately, they were assigned to the overly suspicious Galathers, the commander of the Alliance who was fighting against the Scourge army in Lordaeron. In the history of the elves, just like in this life, they left the Alliance after the Second Battle of the Dark Portal. After betraying the Alliance and being crippled, they ran back to lick the Alliance. Naturally, they were looked down upon everywhere. In the end, they were forced to leave the Alliance by Queen Nagavash's plot and a little deception. In order to solve their magic addiction, they had to rely on Illidan, one of the most unreliable bosses in Azeroth, and use the power of the demon to suppress their magic addiction. Step by step, they were finally tricked by Kill Jaden and attempted to summon Kill Jaden on the rebuilt Sunwell. This forced the Blood Elves to the opposite side of all the races in Azeroth. In the end, Prince Kale, was betrayed and died tragically on the Isle of Quell Danas. Thinking of this, Duque could not help but sigh. Chapter 801. In history, the alliance of the Blood Elves and humans had ended up in such a state. Kale, was not the main culprit. The poor prince was born in this era and unfortunately became a victim of history. The choices he made were all choices that ordinary people would make. Therefore, Duque expressed the deepest understanding and sympathy for Kale, who had reached the end of the road. It was just that in the face of ruthless fate, the Blood Elf Prince seemed particularly powerless. Coupled with his lack of courage and his legendary level E luck. Even if he wanted to kill the thief, he was powerless. As for Marshal Garithus, who had tricked Kale, into running away, he naturally had to bear the main responsibility for Kale, betrayal. This guy was narrow-minded, blindly subjective, and no matter what, he was not a competent leader. However, in the reality before Duque traveled to, leaders like this who were always suspicious of their subordinates could be seen everywhere. That was why there was such a golden saying, "Horses of 1,000 li are common, but Bo Lu is rare." In the hands of Garithus, a talent like Kale, would either become a useless horse and die of depression, or he would become a wild horse and be forced to jump ship. Before traveling to another world, players often compared the two princes, Arthas and Kale, Duque was personally very unhappy. In Duque's eyes, Kaizi was much more adorable than the fool. Although Arthas' original intentions were good, he was too extreme and never listened to anyone's advice. He stubbornly regarded himself as the center of the world, and forcefully hoped that the entire process of the world would develop according to his personal wishes. His fall was due to the conspiracy of the Dreadlord and Kel, the Zed. From another perspective, Arthas' extreme and self-centered personality was also due to the pampering and spoiling of Tarinas, who claimed to be the best in the world. So even though he fell later, what Arthas did was a bloody tragedy like killing his father and teacher. Kale, was different. From the beginning to the end, everything this respectable elf prince did was for his people. He hoped that the people would live a good life, that he could take revenge and destroy the Scourge army, that he could solve the people's demon addiction, and that the first point of departure in everything he does is the people. Kale, who was so kind and had yet to join the Burning Legion, died tragically. Duque's own conscience would never forgive him. Besides, when Duque was sorting out the information of the Rotterdam East Army a few days ago, Duque accidentally saw Garithos' name. From the dossier that Mograine had given him, Duque saw that Galathers was as unreliable as he had been in history. Duque directly took out the queen's seal that Kalia had given him and pushed Garithos to the bottom. He found an excuse to promote him from brigadier general to captain and threw him to the front lines as cannon fodder. In less than a week, Duque received a report that this guy had died in battle. Even his corpse had been recovered. All right, idiots should die early and reincarnate. There was nothing wrong with this sentence. Duque raised his head. Kale, you did wrong this time. We are all high-ranking people, and we all know that there is no room for kinship in the face of great right and wrong. Kale, expression darkened. Duque, you're right to lecture me. Duke sighed in his heart. If Kai Zi had knelt down a little later and waited for him to finish analyzing the well of the sun's mana veins with the system elf, Kai Zi's situation wouldn't be as bad as it was now. Do you have any plans? Kale, looked around. Beside him were hardcore supporters such as the great astromancer Solarian and the astromancer Caponia. His face was full of bitterness. We still love our motherland, but unfortunately, more than 3,000 people will be exiled because of my mistake. I've let them down. But to atone, I think we will go to various places in Rotterdam and continue to fight against the Scourge army in our own way. 3,000 people? Originally, Duque wanted to take Kale, people as his private army, but 3,000 people were a little too many. Also, Duque had to consider the feelings of the elves who were more loyal to Kuel Salis, especially Servanas. Servanas, in particular, was a hurdle that Duke could not avoid. Duque took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Do you know what will happen to you? You and those followers who trusted you and entrusted their lives to you will die meaninglessly in the land that the Scourge army has corrupted." Beside the prince, the great astromancer Solarian could not help but roar in grief and indignation, "What else can we do?" Beside Duque, the paladin Riataline shouted, "Watch your tone, traitor." Solarian was about to refute when Kale, stopped her. "This is my fault. Please don't vent your anger on Duque." The prince's concession made Solarian so sad that she almost cried. Duque gazed at this beautiful elf. He looked at this boss who would have been guarding the storm fortress in the original history of Draenor and would have been killed by the Alliance army. Duque suddenly felt a different kind of emotion. "I know that your current status is a little awkward. Actually, if you are still willing to fight for Azeroth, I hope that you will help the Alliance guard the Dark Portal. This way, we can release the original Dalajan mages and put them into the war against the Scourge army." As soon as this sentence was said, there was a hissing sound in the surroundings. This was not Duque treating them badly. On the contrary, he was treating Kale, and the others too well. After so many years of operation, the Watcher Fortress in the Cursed Land was no longer the bitter and cold place it used to be. The guards of the Watcher Fortress were recognized as the most elite troops in the entire Alliance because they often had to fight with the demons and orcs that came out of the spatial rift. In the past 10 years, there was a saying, if you stay in the Watcher Fortress for 3 years, you will be promoted by 3 ranks when you return. Kale, was humiliated because he had succumbed to his fallen father. Now that Duque wanted Kale, to go to the Watcher Fortress, it was to distance Kale, from the rejection of the elves in Kuel Salis. Secondly, they did not have to go to Lord Darren, which had the worst relationship with the elves, to be looked down upon. Thirdly, it was to let them be gilded. Regardless of whether there was a large-scale invasion or not, the Dark Portal was the front line against the demons and orcs. If they could stay at the front line for a few years and return home, everyone would treat them as a warrior of the Alliance. This was the best redemption for Kale, and his followers. We don't know how to thank you. Of course, we are willing to go to the Watcher Fortress. Duque patted Kai's shoulder. All right then. Get ready. I'll arrange for a ship to send you there. You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.